Good evening all and welcome. Before the video begins, I have a quick announcement. I'm running a special offer on Patreon. To anyone who wants to help support the channel financially, of course it really does mean the world to me, and to anyone who signs up to the $10 tier between today and the 1st of April, will receive a special handwritten thank you note from me in the mail, as well as some exclusive stickers to go along with it, as a thank you. I really do appreciate it, and if you want to find out more, you can find a link at the top of the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This event happened to me around last summer, and it was probably the scariest story in my life, and I wanted to share it with you. Something I've realized growing up year by year is that the world can be an amazing place, but it is filled with some super sick people. And unfortunately I've seen that side firsthand. I am a very social person, and love the opportunity to hang with friends whenever I can. I'm also the type of person who is always looking for the next big thing. I guess I should tell you, I was 18 years old, male at the time of this story, and have a decent sized friends group of both boys and girls. Throughout high school, we had done a lot of crazy stuff together. Being just out of high school, we wanted to do something insane before making our ways for college, and we all decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere for 3 days, for fun, and, for some miracle, all our parents thought it would be fine. So we had 6 people going: me, my girlfriend Stephanie, my friend Brandon and his girlfriend Kaylee, and Stephen and his girlfriend Sarah. We had decided to have 3 different tents for each couple. The reason you could probably guess. Being a former Boy Scout, I was aware on everything we needed to survive for the 3 days: food, water, and other essential supplies. Being the rebellious teenagers we were, we also stocked up on plenty of booze, as well as a bit of the green stuff for our fun getaway. So mid-July, we departed for our camping vacation. After hours of driving and driving down back roads, we eventually found a place that looked secluded, but not sketchy, like some horror stories. There were houses near, but not too close, and again, we weren't looking for a sketchy woods to camp. But unfortunately, there was no service. It took us about an hour to get everything set up. While the girls and Steve finished setting up camp, Brandon and I took a look around while fetching firewood. We eventually came across a cool-looking trail. We weren't too concerned because there weren't houses within a mile radius, and we assumed that those people had used these trails to hunt, which was big in this area. If you're wondering about our car, we drove a Honda Pilot, which was Steve's, that had plenty of room for us and our supplies. We parked the car right close to the site, so we had eyes on it at all times. The first night nothing much happened. We rolled a blunt, drank a bit, and called it a night. The next day we decided to explore the woods a bit, but Brandon and Kaylee stayed behind to watch the site and spend time together. We decided to go down the path we found earlier. Around 20 minutes down the path, Steve spots a metal fence. We approach it to find a cemetery. The cemetery looked old, but there were signs of activity there. And no, not voodoo or cults or anything like that. We mean flowers and notes. And beyond the cemetery we saw a bigger trail that had tire tracks and a half-assed parking lot for the cemetery. We ventured down the path a bit more to spot some deer, then head back because it's getting late. That night we really partied hard because we were to leave the next day and didn't want to return with extra beer nor the green stuff. Now this is the night that was the polar opposite of the other. The other night was peaceful and we assumed the same about this one. But boy were we wrong. Now, you would assume there would have been warning signs earlier in our trip, like a rusty knife on our path or foot tracks around our site. Nope, not at all. All of us woke up to a blood-curdling scream coming from Steve and Sarah's tent. We all heard the fabric being ripped by what we assumed to be something sharp. I guess Steve hit the guy really hard with his flashlight and was able to get both him and Sarah to the car. Now, here's the issue. Steve's tent is closest to the car, while the other two tents are closer to the trail. So to get to Steve's car, we had to get past whatever attacked Steve and Sarah. Luckily, all our drunken selves were gone before getting into his car as he yelled cemetery, and it clicked in my head. The trail on the other side of the cemetery. So I quickly grabbed Brendan, Kaylee, and Stephanie and start running to the trail. I used my phone flashlight to help me see. You might think why you would turn on your flashlight. Well, the last thing I wanted to do was to miss the cemetery and be lost in the woods with the guy who attacked Steve. Well, by the time we get to the trail, Steve and Sarah had gotten the hell out of there from the site, and we could hear the guy chasing us from several yards behind. We were able to find the cemetery rather easily. I hopped the fence first, and when we all get over, we notice Steve has not arrived yet, so we all hid in the cemetery. Luckily, to our advantage, it was pitch black by the time I turned my flashlight off, and we all hid in complete silence. My heart dropped when I heard the metallic shaking as if someone was climbing over the fence. The guy had tracked us down, probably due to the fact that Steve had yelled cemetery. We all stayed still as we heard the ground crunch as the guy took slow steps. When in fight or flight mode, you're capable of a lot more than you would think. Your brain puts on some high-power alert stuff. The guy approached, and I realized I had my small Swiss Army knife in my pocket. As the guy's steps grew closer to me, when he was right about on top of me, I grabbed my utility knife and stuck it behind his leg. The guy tumbled to the ground with a shriek of pain and a metallic sound as he dropped his weapon. As soon as the pair of headlights came around the corner, Steve had made it, and we all ran to the car. While I got up, the light gave me a glimpse of the guy. He was tall, bulky, and had the look of pure hatred in his eye as he clutched the back of his knee, and by his side, a huge machete. I was the last one to get in the car, and before I fully closed the door, we floored it out of there. The girls were bawling their eyes out. We drove until the first house, where we politely knocked and asked for directions to a motel. It was a friendly old couple, and they told us there wasn't one for miles. They took us in and gave us warm food and a place to rest for the remainder of the night. In the morning, the man brought his hunting rifle with us to retrieve our stuff from our campsite. When we got there was nothing stolen, but all our tents were slashed up. The elderly woman called and made a report while we were gone, and when we got back to their home, the officers were there, and we gave them our statements. The officers said there was enough evidence to find the guy, but they promised to search. We headed home later that day. No one said a word on the way home. We were all processing what really happened. The police sadly never found the guy. College split us up a bit, but we barely talk about it as a group since it's been a while. My advice for you all: find yourself a populated place to camp. I don't care if it's some Yogi Bear camp. Be in reach of help and the police. Stay safe, guys. Please. One year when I was about 15, I went to a scout camp in Bear Lake in Idaho. I haven't forgotten about it since, and I still honestly believe I saw something supernatural. The whole week we were there, it had been mostly sunny and warm, but one day it got really cloudy and stormy. It started out as a drizzle during the day, but quickly turned into a torrential downpour at night. The campsite troop was assigned to us that night on the bank of the lake towards the south end. Anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was pitch black and the wind was howling like a chorus of upset toddlers. The reason I had to wake up? I needed to pee like crazy. So we have this buddy rule that if you go anywhere you need to bring your buddy with you, especially at night. It's not called Bear Lake for nothing. So I wake him up and tell him I need to go. He groggily says, "Are you serious?" When he saw me wiggling like a madman, he got out of his sleeping bag, grabbed his flashlight and jacket, and we get our boots on and unzip the tent. Instantly, we become drenched. We start walking towards the outhouse when about midway there we hear this loud-ass roar. Thinking it was a bear, I start to panic. We turned around but couldn't see anything without our flashlights. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminates the sky, and we see a creature with a massive wingspan. A long neck, spiked tail, and as it flew over us, we could see the silhouette of it, its wings in a downbeat. As it passes, the air from the downbeat literally pushes us into the mud. Terrified, we run back to the tent and hide. Needless to say, I totally forgot about needing to pee until morning. To this day, me and my friend still talk about what we saw, and we both agree that it was a dragon. Yesterday, I was walking back home after hanging out with some friends. I was sober and in my right mind. I've never been afraid to walk alone in the dark. I'm quite tall and intimidating looking from a distance, and I always bring a pocket knife when I know I'll be walking in the dark. Anyway, I was walking past some woods on the way back to my house when I heard my mother's voice calling for me. "Gabriel, help!" This was coming from inside the woods. I immediately recognized her voice and turned to look into the woods. She kept calling my name over and over. I couldn't see anything. It was far too dark to see through the trees. "Mum?" I called back, heading towards the woods. She sounded like she was in trouble and scared. I assumed that she'd gone for a run like she did every night, and somehow got lost in the woods. Then I realized it couldn't be her. She texted me only 10 minutes before asking me to come home soon to watch my little sister, so she could go on a run. I stopped dead in my tracks and called my mum. The voice in the woods is still calling my name and getting more frantic by the second. She picked up, and I immediately asked her if she was in the woods. She said no. She was back home with my little sister. I swear to God, as soon as she said that, her voice stopped calling my name from inside the woods. I was overcome with a wave of dread and fear that I'd never felt before. Something in the woods was trying to lure me in using my mother's voice, and it knew my full name, not just my nickname, which made things even scarier because the only person who calls me Gabriel is my mum. I immediately turned and ran faster than I ever had run before back home. When I got back, my legs felt like jelly and my lungs burned. I opened the door and there she was, my mother, sitting on the couch with my sister. I would think this was some sort of prank, but my mum isn't one for pranks, and even if she was, there's no way she could have gotten home before me without me seeing her. My only question is, what was in those woods? I'm a female in my late 20s, 5'8", 135 pounds, who would be described by her friends as very adventurous, immodest, uninhibited to all, too eager to press the boundaries of her experience, and just a tad crazy. The foundation for my adventures was laid some time ago while watching television with my friends, Todd and Beth. We were watching the Survivor TV series, and I piped up and said that they should be totally alone and deprived of clothing. So my friend said, "Oh, like you could do that." And so the challenge was served, and I accepted. As the scenario developed, I was to be abandoned on their private ranch, deprived of any clothing, including shoes, left to wander some 2,500 acres to locate food and drink in hidden ice chests until such time as to I was to be picked up at the far end of the property some 3 miles away. I was provided a mattress to sleep on, placed out in the middle of a huge open pasture with no blankets or pillow. The chests were scattered, and I had to return to the mattress at night to sleep on. Basically, I couldn't sit in one place and wait to be collected. The dangers were poisonous snakes, insects, and some predators, mountain lions and coyotes, and the elements. I spent considerable time conditioning my feet, as I felt that they would be my most vulnerable attribute. So when the day came, we drove 30 miles out to their ranch, and gave me a map to locate the chests, took all my clothing and dumped me in the middle of nowhere for 3 days and 2 nights. At the end of the weekend I was picked up, filthy, sunburned and tired, but I felt victorious. The experience sparked in me the desire to periodically repeat the thrill of the state of vulnerability and adventure. Several times a year I repeat it, although I do find myself without my friends' participation. I do always coordinate with them when I'm going, and to take a cell phone with me. I take minimal provisions, park my car, lock my clothing in it, hide the keys nearby so I don't lose them, and then hike, explore the camp in the rugged wastelands of Texas. My camp is merely a spot where I keep a tent to hide in should it rain. I carry it in a sleeping bag that I stuff with an air mattress. I don't sleep inside it, I just lay on top of it, out in the open. My last adventure started like the others. Lock clothes in the car, hide keys, and hike to my camp. Upon arrival I noticed that the sun and elements had taken a toll on my cheap one-person tent, but it looked like it might protect against mild rain, although none was forecast. I put my sleeping pad in it so it wouldn't blow away, and also my bag of snacks, cell phone, water, and a flask of bourbon. Then I went on my naturalist hike. I explored for several hours, enjoying the wind and sun on my body and feeling part of nature. Towards sunset I hiked back to camp, pulled the sleeping pad out of the tent, sat on it and ate. I sipped on my bourbon as I watched a beautiful sunset, then laid back on my pad and watched the clouds drift across the night sky until I drifted off to sleep. As I slept, more clouds moved in and the wind increased. The cooling breeze brought a chill, and soon I felt the first raindrop plop on my belly. I pulled the bag into the tent and laid on it as I listened to the pitter-patter on the nylon. As the wind and rain increased, I began to hear the thrashing of brush around me. Was the wind that strong? Then I heard the snapping of limbs and what sounded like growls. Not just growls though, snarls. Then a scream rang out. Something began tearing and pulling at the tent. It started pulling the tent over and dragging it off with me inside. At this point my survival instincts kicked in and I bailed out of the tent and started running towards my car. I ran through the drenching rain and cold winds. In the dark and through the brush, scratching my body I ran. I kept hearing the snarling and growling, but it seemed to be fading. Finally I arrived at my car, found the keys, dropped them fumbling in the dark, and after I finally found them again in the mud, unlocked my car and started it and put on the lights. I didn't see anything between the swipes of the wipers. I drove out as fast as I could, got to the front gate and realized I had to get out to open it again. I took a careful look around and quickly ran through the rain, flung the gates open back in my car and began to drive. Soaking wet and muddy, I used my t-shirt laying on the seat to sop up the rain from my hair and face. It was then I noticed I had a rather deep scratch on my right breast that was bleeding quite a bit. I tried to wipe it with my t-shirt, but it didn't help. I drove the 30 miles home wondering if I'd get pulled over on the highway patrol for being out so late, and how I would explain my situation. I got home at 4 a.m. I had just left the soggy t-shirt and shorts in the car. I went to my house, took a shower, and felt the painful sting of the hot water on all the scratches of my body and my bruised feet. I toweled off and held a wash rag firmly against my right breast on the one particular deep scratch that continued to bleed. I sprawled out on my bed under the ceiling fan, trying to sleep. Sleep never really came, So I got up around 9 a.m. and realized I left my cell phone in my bag and I'd left the gate open. Not a good thing. I threw on a pair of loose-fitting terry cloth shorts, a baggy cut-off t-shirt that more than irritated my scratched-up skin, and some shoes and drove over to my friend's house. My car was a mess inside and the t-shirt and shorts I'd left in it were soaked. Upon arrival I explained what happened and asked if they'd go with me to close the gate and retrieve my things. Their first reaction was, "Oh my, look at you," referring to the scratches up my legs, arms and belly. I lifted my t-shirt and showed them the numerous scratches on my breasts. I was a mess. We loaded up in their pickup and drove out to the ranch. The gate was still wide open, so when we drove in, Beth and I got out and closed it behind us. We parked where I parked my car and got out and started the trek up to camp. Upon arrival, we found the remains of the shoddy tent, totally ripped up, the sleeping bag some 50 feet away from where I set it up. Among the debris I found my bag, cell phone was dirty but worked, and my flask was beside it. I opened it and finished it off in one big gulp. We searched but found no footprints that might reveal what attacked me. Todd said he would place game cameras in the area to see if he could record anything, but nothing ever showed up. I have mixed feelings about going back. I miss the experience and may spend time out there again, but only on day trips for now. At the time of this story, the coronavirus quarantine was in effect in my area. After a good week of doing absolutely nothing productive, I was getting cabin fever and wanted to get some fresh air. So I opted to visit a state park in my area where I figured I wouldn't really come across anyone. It was a fairly beautiful day outside, and the temperature was a little cold, but not enough to warrant a jacket. When I pulled up into the parking lot of Wells State Park, Sturbridge, MA, there were a lot of other people that seemed to have the same idea that I did. So I decided that I would take a trail that I wouldn't see many other people on. About 30 minutes into the walk, the forest seemed off. Despite the clear, pretty day, I couldn't help but feel this ominous energy around me. It was a feeling of being overwhelmed. The forest was incredibly alive. Birds were chirping back and forth boisterously, and I spotted hawks flying low at least 7 times, as well as squirrels screaming back and forth at one another in very close proximity to me. Further into the trail it kept pursuing and got increasingly louder before stopping in a few fading calls. At this point I was able to record a video of it. I made the decision to get out of there when the noise stopped and take the trail to Carpenter's Rock, a popular cliff close to the exit of the park. At this point it was silent. I couldn't hear anything but my steps and a few planes flying overhead. Then suddenly almost everything screamed. It was like a short burst of animal calls, of all kinds, and it was loud and simultaneous, like everything in a good mile around me got stabbed in the gut. I hightailed it away, and after 15 minutes I ended up back at the parking lot and spoke with a couple of hikers about it. At least 5 other people heard it and booked it like I did. If there are any rangers or biologists who know what this could be, please let me know. I love to share this story because when I open with, "I encountered a werewolf once," people are immediately intrigued by the absurdity of what I'm saying. These 2 stories happened almost a decade apart, and for obvious reasons I cannot guarantee they are related at all, but it seems reasonable to at least entertain the idea. The first story takes place at my cousin's trailer, a couple of houses down from mine. We live in a rural town at the foot of the Appalachian region, so there's plenty of forest coverage around us. We were playing hide and seek and all was well, until I tagged my cousin and made him the seeker. He hated seeking, so instead of playing the game he decided to sit and quit. on his front porch. The time was around midnight, maybe a bit earlier, so naturally it was pitch black, and perfect for scaring someone. My cousin's friend, my brother and I began to devise a plan to get revenge on my cousin for being a sore loser, and we came up with this. We were to lure him to the edge of the forest, and my brother was to jump out at him. A very simple plan for a couple of 13-year-olds. So we got to it. We managed to convince him that there was something making a noise in the woods, and so he came with us to investigate. As we walked to the edge of the forest, we heard something inside walking with us. I looked at my cousin's friend, and we were both grinning, knowing it was my brother beyond those trees. Then out of nowhere, my brother bursts from the side of my cousin's trailer, screaming and roaring, sending all of us into a fearful panic. He got us good. So good, in fact, that we totally forgot about the noise coming from the forest that could no longer be attributed to my brother. As we were all laughing about the scare, we heard a horrifying noise coming from the depths behind us. It was a loud scream that sounded like a man screaming for help, and slowly changed pitch, and to this day I swear it said help. After about 5 seconds of human screaming sounds, it turned into the most guttural roar I've ever heard personally. It was chilling. We ran inside and my cousin opened the blinds to his windows, and it was right then we noticed the obvious and haunting sight of a full moon. Yes, we don't know what could have made that noise. Yes, there are farms around. It could have been a cow being attacked by coyotes, or pretty much anything that happens in rural America, but I've never heard anything like it before or since. Jump forward 9 years. I'm coming home late from work. As I'm driving, I see 2 bright orange eyes peering at me from the side of the dark road. I thought it may have been a fox or a dog, but as I got closer I realized it was not your average fox or dog. It was a massive, black, wolf-like dog. The animal was so tall while on all fours that it seemed to be almost as big as my car. Its back legs were almost kangaroo-like, very long and muscular looking, while the front legs were short and thin. It dashed across the road and in front of my car, jumping the fence to the left with no struggle. When I got home, I nonchalantly told my family that I finally got to see the werewolf that made the noise so many years ago. I don't necessarily believe that it's an actual werewolf, but I cannot honestly say it isn't. Anyway, I thought you guys might enjoy this story. Keep a keen eye out on full moon nights. I live in rural Appalachia and adore the wilderness. I often invite friends to come out and camp with me. 1, because I enjoy sharing the wilderness with people close to me, and 2, because there's a creature that lives in my woods. A couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5, my aunt bought a small cabin from the Amish and placed it there. She intended it to be used as a playhouse for my younger cousin, but my cousin never enjoyed it and could never stay a full night there. The weekend off of school came around, and I called out my friend to see if he'd like to stay in the woods with me for the weekend. He agreed and had his mum bring him out. We started walking and made it not even halfway to our destination when he asked if we could just stay in the new cabin for a night or 2, because the weather said it was going to storm anyway. So we walked back to the top of the hill so that I could text my aunt, and she gave me the okay. It was starting to get dark, so we went ahead and settled down completely in the cabin and started eating what was supposed to be camping rations. We spoke for hours until we looked out the window and noticed it was getting dark and the rain was coming out. We decided it was best to lay down and get to sleep. He passed out almost instantly, leaving me alone in pitch darkness listening to the sound of heavy rain hitting the tin roof. I didn't even realize I fell asleep until I heard a loud knocking and rattling on the door, and figured my buddy went out to pee or something. The door had a large window, and I could clearly see someone standing there. I was dreading having to crawl out the blankets into the slightly moist, cold air, to let him in after he somehow locked himself out. So I rolled over to prepare to stand up, and I was facing his bed, which I couldn't really make out a shape 100% from, but as I forced my eyes I could tell he was still in it. I froze and was in pure terror for what seemed like at least an hour, when I heard the thing at the door make a sound akin to clearing its throat and running into the woods. I waited at least 20 minutes before asking my friend if he was awake, and he immediately said, "Yeah." "Did you see that thing and hear it too?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Were you awake when it was whispering?" "No," I replied. We lay there too scared to move or make a sound above a whisper for hours. I would start drifting off and almost immediately would start hearing something tap on the windows, but I would try my best to ignore it, even when I could clearly hear something rubbing its finger on the edge of the tin roof on my side of the cabin. Morning came, and I felt like death. My buddy didn't feel as bad and apparently thought the figure was a dream, but he quickly realized that it couldn't be, the more details that I brought up. We packed up and started to make our way back to my house. Halfway up the hill to my house, I realized the scariest part of everything the night had to offer was that we never locked the door. The rest of the way up my hill was spent with me constantly looking over my shoulder down at the cabin. To this day, I haven't spent another night in it or gave it a glance for longer than 2 seconds on my way to the woods. There's a locally famous haunted road in my town called Upsom Road. However, it is more commonly known as Green Lady Cemetery Road. You can look it up online. There have been tons of reports of incidents on this road. It's a hotspot. If you grew up in my town, you've been down Green Lady Cemetery Road. I could go on for days about telling you the stories I've heard from others about this location, but I would rather tell you about the 2 experiences I've had on this road. The second one made me swear to never go down it, day or night, again. The road had never been paved. They've left it terribly bumpy and as a dirt road to stop people from going down it. Most times of the year, the town puts up barriers so no one drives through it. Not because it's a walking path, because simply they don't want people going down there. At one end of the road, there is an old piece of property that the town bought, that you'll often see a police car sitting in. If you decide to pull onto the road, you'll be pulled over immediately and be told you're trespassing, even though it is in fact public property. They can't legally stop you from driving down there, but most people don't know that and will turn you around. The road starts off as just a wooded dirt road. It's only about a mile long, and you can drastically see a change of scenery in a very short amount of time. As you pass the wooded area, you come up to a section of road where on your right is a small swamp, and on your left is more forest. However, nothing seems to be able to live out there. When you hit this section of road, you're officially in the hot spot. If you park your car and look around, you'll notice that trees don't seem to grow there. They are all dead and rotten. You will not hear birds chirping. It's dead silent. Going just slightly further up the road, just past the swamp, is where things get very eerie. On the left-hand side of the road is a very, very old cemetery where the Green Lady stays. The headstones are all dated from the 17 to 1800s. There's also a small foundation next to the cemetery where a house used to stand. It's been reported time and time again that people have witnessed a green mist floating around the cemetery. People have seen this green mist form into the shape of a woman in a dress, walk back and forth around the cemetery. And there are a few theories as to who this woman is, but I'm not completely sure anyone knows exactly who she was. Anyway, it's a bit of a rite of passage here in town where every kid who gets their license drives down the road at night, just one time to be able to say they've done it. Here are my 2 stories about it. When I purchased my first car, the first thing my friend Jordan and I did was take a drive down that road. I'd picked him up at his house at around 10:30 at night, and we drove over there. It had been extremely hot that day, and towards the night it had rained a bit and cooled down a bunch. That combined with the swamp being on the road, it was so foggy you couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of you. It was absolutely the worst time to be driving down there, to be honest. We'd both been a bit nervous and the fog wasn't helping us at all. We had been creeping down the road slowly, so we couldn't really see where we were going. We had gotten about 200 feet from the cemetery when a teenager comes running out of the fog and runs right past our car. We didn't recognize him, but this kid was bolting down the road. He was dressed in a grey Nike t-shirt and black baseball shorts. He looked like he was about our age, so we were even more confused that we didn't recognize him. Jordan and I both agreed that the kid looked like he was running away from something, so we decided to turn around to offer him a ride. Mind you, there is a ton of bears and other large carnivores here, so we thought perhaps something might be chasing him. I quickly turned the car around and started driving back in the direction the kid was running. We drove for a little bit but didn't see him. The fog had started to clear up a bit, so we were able to see a decent distance in front of us, but we still couldn't see him. He wasn't on the road. He wasn't in the forest. He was simply gone. I rolled down my window and started to yell, "Hey man, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" hoping that the kid would pop out from behind a tree or something. But nothing. The kid was simply gone. Maybe he was some kid who decided to walk down that road at night and got spooked. Maybe he saw headlights and thought we were cops and hid from us. We still don't know to this day. We had asked around in school the next day if anyone knew of anyone who went for a walk down that road at night, but we never heard anything. If there was a kid out there that late and he ran up into the forest, that's even scarier than the thought of the ghost teen running past our car. I'll never forget the look on that kid's face as he ran past our car. He looked like he was scared, panicking, and I really wish I were able to find out who he was. Now for my second and final experience. Jordan, the same friend from the previous story, had gotten his first car, so obviously the first thing we had to do was go down the road. The weird thing about this drive is that once again as we got closer to the cemetery, a thick layer of fog had started to pour out of the trees from the swamp, although the weather had been the same all day, with no rain and no temperature drops, nothing. Luckily this fog wasn't as thick as before, and we could see in front of us. We'd gotten up to the cemetery, and Jordan parked the car. We sat around for a little while and looked at the cemetery. The forest just observed everything. After 5 or so minutes, Jordan looks at me and says, "Dude, how weird would it be if I looked in the rearview mirror and there was someone in the back seat?" Who says that? I mean honestly, dude, look where we are, it's not even a joke. That's seriously not funny, bro, I told him. He looked up in the mirror and screamed. I spun around, looked in the back seat and there was nothing there. He started laughing. "I got you, bro." "Again, you're not funny, Jordan." He didn't want to keep wasting the gas, so he turned off the car and shut off the headlights. Now this idiot has us sitting on a famously haunted road in the middle of the night, in the pitch darkness surrounded by forest. We're parked right in front of the old building foundation of the cemetery. It's just ahead of us. We sat there for a few minutes smoking cigarettes and talking about nonsense. I'm kind of staring off into the trees at this point, honestly a bit bored, when out of nowhere Jordan says, "Hey, there's someone in the forest." I shrug it off, assuming he's messing with me, when I see a subtle light in the forest behind the cemetery. It looked like a flashlight with batteries that were as close to dead as they could be. The light vanished after a few seconds, and we both sat there with our eyes glued to the patch of forest. Roughly 30 seconds later, a tall, ovular light started to appear in the same spot that the light came from. Jordan says to me, "Okay dude, I'm done, let's go." And I'm telling him, "No, hang on, wait." His hands are on the key. He's getting ready to start up the truck and drive away. The light was very faded, a little hard to see, but when the forest behind it is pitch black, it stood out. It slowly started to move along the rock wall at the back side of the cemetery, and Jordan started up the truck. He was so ready to leave. As his headlights kicked on, we saw a green mist floating around the road. Jordan yells out, "Screw this," and slams the truck in reverse and backs up until he felt far enough away to turn around. We had always heard reports of the green mist. Supposedly, if you wait long enough, you'll see the green lady walk around in the mist. But we were too scared to wait for that to happen. I never thought the green mist was real until that night. And to this day, I swear I will never drive down that road ever again. I highly recommend you look it up. It's probably one of Connecticut's most famous paranormal hotspots. I live in Wyoming, Michigan, about a walking distance away from a resurrection cemetery. If you look it up on Google Maps, you'll see it has a tree line surrounding it. The tree line closest to the woods is where I've seen something multiple times. Well, you can determine what it is for yourself. The first encounter I had with it was with my sister. She was going to walk through the cemetery. It was late at night, and I had the gut instinct to go with her, so I did. We were playing Pokemon Go, and I didn't like the forested area around it, especially this large pine tree. That, via a maintenance path, led to the crematorium. I was scared out of my mind, but we went towards the crematorium anyway to get a Pokestop and find a Jigglypuff. We had to go so close that we were now on the maintenance path, but the nice cobblestone half. It was when I looked to my right that I saw the creature, hunched over. It almost looked like a normal human being, but more terrifying. It appeared to have seen me too because it stood up. It was tall, at least 7 feet in height. I told my sister to run and we legged it home, where I proceeded to pray in my room for a while. My mum had a sighting too. She mentioned seeing it, something grey, hunched over the top of the pine tree. She mentioned seeing something grey and hunched over in the top of the pine tree. When she looked back though, it was gone. Safe to say we went home early that day. I consider myself a little bit sensitive, and when I close my eyes sometimes around that area, I think I can see it. The 2 gaping holes staring back at me. My mum described the creature, and I recognized it as something I'd drawn a few weeks ago. I burned this image, but have since redrawn it. My most recent sighting, and the one that kept me from returning to the cemetery, happened in broad daylight with a friend. His name is Mark. We wandered around the cemetery for hours until my arms started hurting, and I decided that we should go home for a snack. As we walked, my anxiety heightened. I told him about this creature, but I suspected we wouldn't have to worry as it was daytime. As we were walking along the sidewalk, about to reach the tree line, I saw a dead squirrel and dog in the middle of the sidewalk. I looked up, and I see the crawler running straight past into the tree line. It was grey, and ran on all 4s rather than 2 legs. I told my friend to run, and he did. We both ran until we reached the intersection. I would appreciate any advice on what the hell this is. Midsummer's Eve about 10 years ago. Me and my ex-significant other were planning on spending a romantic weekend at his mother's childhood home, which was now serving as a summer cottage. The cottage was located on a tiny island, and in order to reach it you had to first leave your car by the road. It was really remote, so this could be done. Then walk about 2 kilometers through the woods and finally row a boat across a small river. When we reached the cabin, we found the key to the front door was missing. I was already feeling like there was something out of place, but decided I was probably just a bit tired from the journey. My then significant other was really skinny and long, so he managed to wiggle his way through a window and find the door from inside. We then proceeded to unpack our stuff and got a fire going to warm up the sauna, a must on midsummer around here. My ex told me we were going to sleep in the first room on the left, the old master bedroom, and I went in to make the bed ready for us. As I entered, I was at once hit by a strong feeling of dread. We were not welcome there. I tried to shake it off because I didn't want it to ruin our weekend, so I said nothing about it to my ex. We decided to have a bite to eat before going to the sauna, and as we were eating I noticed my ex started to look a bit pale. When I asked him if he was doing okay, he told me he was feeling really ill all of a sudden, and there was a sudden chill that was going through him constantly. I put my hand on his forehead. He was clearly running a high fever. He was feeling fine just before, so we were both a bit puzzled by his sudden unwellness. We thought it would be best for him to rest for a while, so we went into the bedroom to lie down. I wasn't thrilled about going in there, but it was the only place with a bed at the time, so we really had no choice. I remember very vividly what happened next. We were lying on the bed, my ex with his eyes closed and breathing heavily, sickly warmth pouring from him like crazy, and me very much awake and alert. It began as a cold feeling of dread, just like before, but this time it kept escalating to the point of pure fear. My heart was pounding faster and faster as I realized we were in the middle of nowhere. We had no phone, and my ex was the only one who could even drive. Then I saw it in the doorway. A shadowy figure, clearly male, was standing on the doorstep. It was leaning towards us, radiating hate. It seemed reluctant to step all the way in, but made sure I knew if it chose to do so. There was no other way out of the room except through the window, but that was sealed shut. I mustered all my strength, shook my ex by the shoulder and explained to him that we had to leave now. He was still very weak, but I managed to get him up and packing. The figure was nowhere to be seen. It had vanished when I focused on getting my ex to his feet. So we packed up in a hurry and left. I told my ex I had felt and seen something strange, but mainly I explained our haste with the fact that he was ill, and we needed to get back to civilization while he was still able to travel. But what do you know? By the time we had left and crossed the river, he was feeling a lot better, and his fever was all but gone. We reached the car, and he mentioned something about maybe going back now because he was feeling okay, but I quickly refused. We drove back to his parents' house, where there was a small midsummer family gathering taking place. People asked why we returned so soon, but I didn't say anything to anyone about what had happened, only that we came back because he was feeling ill. We had a few drinks, chatted with his relatives, and everything seemed to be going back to normal. So much so that I started to doubt myself. Had I really even seen something? I must have been overreacting, imagining things. Then my ex's uncle speaks up. By the way, did you know that the old place is haunted? I felt my stomach curling up with fear as if I'd swallowed an ice cube stone. Yeah, it really is. I remember my dad telling me about it. He said that even before he was born there were strange things happening down there all the time, according to his own father. Then one day a weird old man appeared at the door and said he was there to help, and proceeded to draw lines across the yard with some kind of metal wire while chanting silently to himself. When the guy was finished, he said he had reconducted the energy flow around the house so that the house would from now on be left untouched by evil, then went on his way. I remember all this when my brother said he had done some landscaping at the cottage and removed a bunch of old wire that was running on the ground. I wonder if the ghost is back now. I heard he really likes to frequent the master bedroom. Isn't that where you guys were sleeping? He laughed heartily at his last comment. I just sat there feeling sick to my core. I didn't dare to ask more details about this claimed entity. why it was thought to be there, or what it had previously done to make itself known, but couldn't stop wondering what would have happened had we not left. I want to share a story about a time when I was 14 where I became lost in the woods in a pretty familiar area. I was hunting in the mountains, somewhere around Huntingdon. I don't remember exactly where it was, as it was 25 years ago. The cabin we used to go to was at the top of a mountain, only accessible by dirt road. After driving several miles up, you would come to the top of the mountain, and the road would circle around at the end back to where you started. So one way up and one way down. The road itself was wide enough for 1.5 cars, so you would have to pull over some to let an overcoming vehicle pass. I left the cabin by myself in the afternoon and walked down the driveway. I turned left on the road and walked maybe half a mile, and then turned right into the woods and walked down the mountain to a spot I've hunted before. I was probably 1/4 mile down the mountain, and I eventually reached my spot, which had a large number of boulders and deer paths weaving in and around them. I sat there for a while and saw nothing, and decided to head back up. Now the area I was in was steep, no doubt about that, so it would naturally take a lot longer to climb up than to walk down. I was hiking, and it seemed to be taking longer than usual, but I thought nothing of it. After half an hour, 45 minutes of walking, however, I started to get nervous. It was getting dark, and surely I would be coming up on the dirt road soon. The sun kept setting, and I kept going, and no road. It was dusk now, and I thought there was no way I was down that far, and it would take me this long. How the hell did I miss the road? No way I missed it. Literally, there's no possible way for me to miss it. It circles around the entire top of the mountain, and now it's dusk, and I decide that maybe I somehow did just walk over it. I head back down the mountain for another 15 to 30 minutes, and there's nothing. At this point, I'm scared. How am I missing the road? I'm getting annoyed at myself, trying to rationalize my position, trying to slow down and think. So I head back up. I had a dull flashlight, and it was just enough amber-colored light to let me see obstacles so that I wouldn't trip. After walking and hiking back up for some time, I sat down. I was alone with a poor, pathetic excuse for a light, and had no idea where I was. And that's when I noticed it. The nothingness. Nothing was making noise. Nothing was moving. At that point, I decided to go back down the mountain, the entire way. There was a really small ravine I'd have to climb down and out, but I thought maybe it was the only way, to walk down out the mountain and hit civilization. I walked for maybe half an hour, and I came across the dirt road and was shocked. There was no way I missed the road. To this day, I cannot believe that I missed it. I guess it's possible, but it seems like, based on the amount of time walking, that I should have crossed it more than once. And if I did, again, I should have realized I was on a dirt road. I actually haven't thought about this in a long time. It's just one of those things in life that's a bit crazy. I should start by telling you a bit about myself. I'm a guy in my 20s. I'm 6'4". I'm a vet, student, and train kickboxing. There isn't much that scares me, and people can regard me as an intimidating dude. My university is on top of a hill outside of town. From my dorm window on the 7th floor, I can see huge wheat fields and the nearby forest. My first encounter was last year. I have a German shepherd called Hades and a husky pup called Ragnar. That day, I left uni quite late. It was already dark outside. Usually I don't mind taking them out at night, as I can let them run without their leashes. They are trained, and I know they're going to listen to me. Besides, I know everyone knew them and wouldn't hurt them if they were left out. They have collars that light up, since Hades is fully black and Ragnar is fully white, which makes it hard to see him during the winter, if I could see them all the time. We walked for a while, and they were playing and running around, and at some point Hades stops and starts growling, looking into the wheat fields down the hill. I didn't think about it. There are bats, owls, and other critters around us. I leashed them, not wanting to run after them if they decided to go chase something. About half an hour of non-stop growling later, I'd had enough and decided to take Hades home and go out so that Ragnar can run a bit more. I got home and expected him to go into his cage. He likes sleeping there and I never lock it. But that night all he did was stand at the window looking out. Since the pup was whining and wanting to go out again, I tried to drag Hades into the cage and lock him until I got back. Who knew? Maybe he might be trying to go out the window. I got a look, and on the parking lot I saw a dark figure circling the cars. Thinking that it might be some local trying to steal something, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at it. It wasn't a thief. In fact, I wouldn't say it was human at all. It looked up, eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight. It was black. Its head looked very similar to Hades. It was standing on all fours, but when I shone the light, it stood up. The roof of the cars barely reaching its midsection. It let out a growl, which I later learned that many of the tenants heard. Hades then went wild, trying to bust out the cage. Ragnar was whining ever louder. I realized he didn't want to go out. He was trying to get as far away from the window as possible. The growl made me flinch and I dropped the flashlight through the window. I tried to see it again, but it was too dark. I heard the crunching of snow as it left. The next morning I went to find my flashlight and found huge dog-like footprints in the snow and a foul smell that still lingered. I borrowed infrared binoculars from a hunter friend of mine ever since, and I've seen it 4 times in the forest, twice crossing the field, and once it's come near the hill to look up. I and my roommate have been taking turns keeping watch at night when Hades starts growling. I don't take the dogs out at night, and Ragnar doesn't play and run around anymore. He just stays pressed against my feet. I hope he grows out of it. I lived in Montana on some land my dad owns, and I was hiking up a mountain like I do frequently. I heard this really weird screaming coming from the other side of the mountain, away from my house and deeper into the woods. It wasn't a mountain lion, too deep and long, and it went on for about 10 seconds, and I'm fairly confident it wasn't a bear. It kind of sounded like a human, almost distorted, almost like someone was possessed by something, sort of like what you'd hear in a horror movie. I got to the top of the mountain, pulled out my binoculars, and looked into the general direction of the scream. That's where I saw it. A weird, humanoid-looking creature, as white as paper and without any hair or clothes or genitals for that matter. And its arms were longer than its body. It had these huge black eyes that covered most of its face, and it was walking, but as soon as I saw it, it stopped and stared at me. I watched it carefully, I don't even know for how long, thinking that it was staring straight into my soul. I had to look away because my eyes had started watering from not blinking. When I looked back, after wiping my eyes, it was gone. I couldn't see it anymore, which made me think it was a weird hallucination or something. I decided to get the hell away from the area and ran back home. The scariest part is that 5 minutes after I walk in the door, I hear the scream again. It was much closer and made my ears ring. Now that I think about it, I remember that I could hear my dad yell at me whenever I needed help with something every other time I was up there. I'm pretty sure it was where I was standing where I first saw it. My dad heard it too, so it wasn't just a hallucination. And my neighbor was talking about the screams a week after it happened. I've researched it as best I could. but I've never found anything except a description. I've never seen it since, and my dad hasn't either. One of the many reasons I moved in with my mum in Arizona. My mum's side of the family used to have a small cabin in the woods, in the Pocono Mountains surrounded by trees. But it wasn't like a fancy cabin with a hot tub, more like a very small hunting cabin built by my late grandfather and my uncles. It had a small porch with a picnic bench, a gravel lot to park, and then maybe 15 feet away a nice-sized fire pit with a bench and a few logs around it. The driveway was a very long drive up the side of the mountain, off a very secluded highway. The house was small, but the land they owned was pretty big. We had a neighbor, but he was maybe half a mile away, maybe a bit closer. We couldn't see them through the woods and rarely heard them except for maybe some gunshots during hunting season. You could hear the occasional car on the highway, but otherwise, the house was kind of in the middle of nowhere. We used to always spend time up there when we were younger, with all our cousins. However, just me and my family would go up there every once in a while in the summer. We would go hiking and visit the local amusement park and have big bonfires and roast marshmallows and cook burgers. At night, we would walk further down the drive towards the highway where the trees weren't as close together so that we could see the stars. Without all the light pollution, you could seriously see everything. It was a great time. Anyway, one summer I was 13. Our family of 5 took a trip up there. My family being me, my 2 older sisters, my mum and dad, and I used to be, and still am, afraid of the dark, and especially the woods. Especially the woods in the dark. So I would really only go outside if one of my siblings or a parent were with me, which they usually were. One night, we lit the bonfire and were talking and roasting marshmallows and enjoying the summer night. I was pretty tired from whatever we had done earlier that day, so I decided to join my mum inside on the couch. I ended up falling asleep in the living room. I woke up a few hours later. Upset, I fell asleep and missed the rest of the fire. I pulled aside the curtains to check if anyone was still outside, and from the window I could see the fire pit clearly still ablaze, and what I assumed was my dad sitting on the bench by himself. Not wanting my dad to be alone, I opted to join him. Now, since I hate the dark, and even though the pit wasn't terribly far, that walk still felt long in the pitch dark. I don't know what possessed me to go outside without looking for any other member of my family, or even check the time. So I opened the door and stepped onto the porch and called my dad to ask him why he was still there. The pit was maybe 15 to 20 feet away, but he should have heard me in the night. I clearly see the fire pit and can clearly see my dad, even though he was sitting on the bench on the opposite side of the fire. Confused, I start to walk down the steps, and then slowly towards the fire pit, asking him why he wasn't responding. As I get closer, I keep calling him, when I realize that while I should be hearing the roar of the fire, there is absolute and complete raging silence. And then I notice that there is no one sitting by the bench anymore. At this point, I am only feet away from the fire and bench. My blood immediately turned ice cold. I whipped around and sprinted back up the house, not daring to stop or look behind me. I locked the door, ran into my dad's bedroom only to find him there under his blankets asleep. I didn't want him to wake up, to let him know how stupid I was, so I just crawled under the covers beside him and prayed to fall asleep. The next morning I told my parents what happened. My mum keeps telling me it was just a dream, but I woke up from a dream on the couch right before, and then went outside and this all happened. I used to have the same recurring dream every time I went to the cabin, and I would only have that dream when I was in the cabin. I specifically remember having this very same dream again, and then waking up on the couch. This same creepy dream is the same reason I always slept next to my dad anytime we stayed at the mountains. I never felt safe sleeping alone. That meant my mum would share a bed with my eldest sister. They both snored, so it was fine. My dad tells me it wasn't possible. One, because he always deadbolts the door before he goes to sleep, and there was no way I would have been able to push the deadbolt open without him waking up. And two, because he always puts the fire out before bed as well, which is basic fire safety. All I know is what I saw, and that it wasn't a dream. I was about 19. My best friend had become friends with a guy called Chris. Chris lived with his mum, Crystal, in a small house located in a village in Cumberland. Crystal was really cool and would let us hang out there. The house was built in the 50s or 60s. All the doors in the house were glass. The living room had 2 entrances with double doors, and there was a conservatory on the back of the house, which the other doors led to. Basically, at night, no matter where you stood, you could see everywhere on the ground floor, either directly or reflected in the conservatory. There was a small garden with a fence, and then the woods. The people in the village itself were weird. We would have a nervous laugh about it being like the Children of the Corn, Village of the Damned, or the League of Gentlemen. The kids in the street would stop and stare as we walked by. Shopkeepers would stop what they were doing and smile but never say a word the whole time. People walking down the street would either be mumbling or laughing to themselves. On a few occasions, they would walk until just past us, scream and then run off down the street, as we all stood looking bewildered at each other. And I would say, I hope you know we're all gonna pass here. I'm not exaggerating when I say that is how everyone was on the street. They behaved in that way without fail. It was creepy, absurd, and a little bit hilarious. One day me and my friend Bud went to the local pub, where everyone stopped and turned to look at us. The pub was full of men in polo shirts. Anyway, you just need to understand the nature, the surrealism of this place, where everything was quite strange. It wasn't long into my first visit before we got Crystal talking about some of the weird things that go on, not just in the house but the whole area. She had collected newspaper clippings from the local paper to back up some of her stories. Here are some events that I remember she told me. If you've ever heard of the Bonnie Bridge UFO sightings, on one of these occasions, a UFO was spotted near the village. The woods were well known in the area for the amount of bodies that turned up. It was rumored that a coven of witches practiced black magic in the woods. People said they had seen robed groups of people in the woods and white horses in nearby fields. People had been found with their lives taken where the trails cut off. Chris and Crystal told me one night the entire street was out in the backyard. There was chanting coming from the woods. They said it was so loud it must have been at least 50 people. Men, women, deep voices, high voices. Crystal said the creepiest part was as soon as the chanting stopped, it would instantly start in another part of the forest, like they were jumping from one part to another, or a group of hundreds of people throughout the forest were performing some perfectly coordinated chanting in the dark. To a bunch of teenage adventurers, this place was crazy. Crystal also mentioned that strange objects had been left on the steps in the backyard, feathers and twigs tied with twine, and a few times robed figures standing just beyond the fence. Well, that was all mind-blowing. And then she started to tell us about the house. Both Crystal and Chris refused to use the second-floor bathroom to go in to the spare bedroom. At some point, Crystal had noticed scrabbling sounds coming from the loft. She assumed it was either a rat or squirrel that had gotten in. Also that all the spoons in the house had started to go missing. Each time she returned to the house, another spoon was gone. Finally, there were no spoons left, and she tore the house apart trying to find just one with no luck. She searched everywhere except the spare bedroom. She was pumping herself, getting ready to go in, when she heard a bump from the loft. Oh no, she thought. There's someone living in the loft. She called the police. Chris had come home from a friend's house at this point, and they both listened to the bumping and scrabbling as they waited for the police. Even the police heard it when they arrived. They pulled down the hatch, went in, and found nothing, except all the spoons laid in a row in front of a burned-out candle. The policeman, straight-faced, suggested she get an exorcist. They never told me why they didn't go into the other rooms, but Crystal believed she was cursed and that her ex-husband had something to do with it. Despite the honesty in their face and the clippings and all the things I'd experienced in my life, at that point I was skeptical. It's hard to let go of that, even when we did start experiencing things. Often a group of us would be hanging out, watching a movie or something when this would happen. The first time we all sat there, gradually it dawned on me I could hear something. A perfectly natural sound. Someone was in the kitchen, clearing dishes away. I could see reflected in the conservatory window, someone moving back and forward in the kitchen. I looked left and right, doing a head count, and felt my blood drain. I turned to my buddy and said quietly, "Who the hell's in the kitchen?" Still looking at the TV, he said, "Oh, it's, quick head count. I don't know." The rest of the group had begun to catch on. They saw it too. We armed ourselves with anything we could find, golf clubs, chairs, guitars. Half of us took the hallway entrance, and the other conservatory entrance. As soon as someone could see directly into the kitchen, the noise straight up stopped, the clattering right up until the very last moment. None of us slept that night. However, it happened again and again. We purposefully took people who had never been there and knew nothing about it, and waited for them to notice, and it was always the same without fail. Sometimes when we all decided to crash for the night, the only place left was the spare room. I went up, opened the door, and some big guy had beat me to it, right there all wrapped up in the quilt. I went back downstairs with a sigh. My buddy asked me what was up and I explained. He's adamant no one is in there, pointing out where everyone is sleeping. I agree, but I'm also adamant someone is there. We both go up, open the door, and the quilt is flat and hanging off the bed. The second time it happens, I was with my girlfriend. She never set foot in that room again, but it wasn't just us that saw that one either. One night, one of my pals was taking his sweet time in the toilet. I decided to use the one upstairs. I walked up the stairs. I was looking down slightly. The top step came into view. It was dark, but nothing like pitch black, and there on top of the steps were legs, a black suit trouser, and a pair of polished black shoes. I tried with all my might to look up, but I just couldn't do it, and I went back down the stairs. One night it was Chris's birthday. He had a big party, loads of people, and the house was packed, blaring music, and at about 3 a.m, Chris takes me up to his room window. "Listen," he says. I run downstairs, grab my mate. He shuts off the music and everyone can hear it. Screams. 50-odd teenagers standing in the backyard and hanging out of a window in pure silence. I swear to you, I will not exaggerate. These were the most blood-curdling screams I've ever heard. It sounded like a woman or child, and it was coming from the forest. I tell myself it was probably a fox, but whatever was happening to that thing, I would not wish on anyone. It was crying in pain and it was loud. The sound would become higher pitched and pop, and then gurgling and then start all over again. Every single one of us stood there for about an hour. Girls started crying. Some of the guys were freaking out, and there was nothing else to do. We couldn't just keep partying with that going on. The sound was absolute suffering. Maybe you guys in the States have heard of things like that, with big predators over there. But the biggest predators we have here are foxes. And there was no commotion or barking or shouting, just the sound of this poor thing screaming and gurgling over and over, like it was on a megaphone. In all my years of camping in Scotland, I've never heard anything like that. However, the woods were beautiful in the daytime. We would walk through them often. Every time without fail, when we went through the woods during the day, high above us, 2 crows would be flying in the sky, cawing and knocking each other. But there was some other strange stuff in there. There was an area with wooden joists that had been merged into a tree, like they had grown out of it. They had nails protruding over them and stained with viscous black liquid. Near there, where the branches from the tree separate, that were perfectly twisted together. Strange symbols carved into a tree. Once we found large piles of white hair at the base of these trees, a ring of a baby oak tree that had been cut down. The stump in the center seemed to be blood-stained. There was an area where many tall tree saplings had been bent over and secured to make arches tall enough for a man to walk through. We had the place mapped out well in our heads. We knew where to go from each landmark to find the others. The area was segmented by roads too, but at night, even if we followed the compass to a T, nothing was in the right place. Fair enough, it's dark, you can get turned around, but what really gives me the creeps is that at night, and only at night, about 15 feet northeast from the ring of the tree stumps was a huge U-shaped hedge about 15 feet high. The U-shaped hedge created a corridor about 30 feet long with a dead end. It was monolithic, but we could only ever find it at night. Chris had a small den that he built when he was a kid. We hung out there a few hours one day, just chatting and stuff, and then went back. The next day we returned to the den, and there was a perfect 3-foot wide black circle enscorched in the grass around the den. It was summer. The grass was tall, thick, and dry. I don't know how someone managed to do that. I think our constant investigating was annoying someone. We took it as a warning, but we didn't stop. After that, we weren't going so much, and in smaller groups, but I don't remember much else happening after that. This next story is from one of Chris's other group of friends that I heard before going to his house. So Chris had another group of friends who refused to go back to the house. Me and my best buddy knew one of them well, Darren. He was a really happy-go-lucky, really funny and cared about people, an honestly great guy. They had similar experiences as we did, except these two. Not sure what order they happened in, so I'll start with what happened to Darren. We had been told that Darren would not talk about this. He would not say a word about it, having heard the story. I get that. So me and my buddy sat there with Darren in a pub in Glasgow city centre. It was a chance meeting, but since he'd had a few drinks, I thought it would be worth asking. I said, "Dude, Crystal's house, what happened?" He stiffened up and I said, "I heard you won't talk about it. Can you just confirm what we've heard, even if it's just with a nod?" He nodded and confirmed the whole story that way, and I'll just tell you as I've been told it. He was sitting in the conservatory. It was a nice day, bright and sunny, and Darren was sitting alone. He had his headphones on listening to music when something caught his eye from his peripheral vision. He turned to look. Standing at the conservatory door was a woman draped in a black robe. She had long, straight blonde hair. Her eyes were wide and she was staring right at him. She brought her hand up and started tapping the glass frantically with her fingernail, all the time staring wide-eyed right at him. Darren freaked, got up from the couch, looked back, and the woman had moved back, but in the same position, still staring, but now just tapping at the air. He moved to the end of the couch, looked back, and she was further back, doing the same thing. He got to the kitchen door. She's back further, doing the same thing. He ran into the house, one last look back, and she's still on the other side of the fence. Still staring, still pointing. Darren didn't stop running. He ran upstairs into the bathroom, lifted the toilet seat and started smacking it on his head. His friends heard and pulled him away and calmed him down. After he confirmed the bit about the toilet, I asked him why. He said he just didn't know. One day they all decided to trek down into the woods. I think the group was about 8 strong, if not 7. Maybe one stayed behind. Anyway, Adam waited about 5 minutes after the rest set off because he wanted to freak them out. Adam had army experience. He was tall, 6'5". I knew him pretty well. He was cocky, funny, and confident. He told Crystal what he was doing and set off. About 2 hours went by and the rest of the group came back. Crystal asked, "Where's Adam?" You guys guess what happened next. They all went back in search of Adam. It was getting dark. They split up but stayed in earshot of each other. As they tell it, they searched for hours in the night. They met the edge of the woods, very upset at this point, losing hope. One of them shouted, "For God's sake, if you're there, make a noise. Do something." Right there and then, they hear a thump. They follow the sound, and only about 5 feet away, there he is, on the ground, leaning against a log, groggy. They grab him up, drag him back to the house all the way, and he's just slurring, "Witches, they got me, they got me." He had blood and a wound directly on top of his head. Blood was covering his face. He was close to delirious, so what they managed to get out of him was this. He ran down after them. He used his army training to sneak up on them. He was watching them from behind a tree. Then wham! He's on the ground leaning against a log. 3 women in white robes with blonde hair are staring in front of him. They tell him he shouldn't be there, and if he keeps coming it will be dangerous. The next thing he knows, his friends are shouting, asking him to make a noise. He groggily grabs a branch and starts hitting the log he's leaning on. He swears he follows them quite far into the woods, and the fact they found him where they did makes no sense. I spoke to him a lot about this. He was the most willing to talk and strangely the least bothered about the whole thing. He was also the only one in that group who wanted to go back, but that seemed to be the last straw for the rest of them. This is one more thing I almost forgot, that Chris told me about. Him and a mutual friend called Taryn went into the woods one day. They went to the den. They said it was a nice day until they started to head back. They heard a whistling noise. It got louder and louder, and they walked and walked until they were sure they'd left the woods. Then they began to panic. They started to run. The whistling started coming from in front of them, and they changed direction and ran. Taryn said the woods became a blur. They ran another way, and no matter which way they ran, the whistling was in front of them. Eventually, on the point of exhaustion, they fell out of the woods onto the road that led home. Taryn said it was the scariest experience of his life. He felt like they would never escape, and said he kept trying to slow down and be calm, but he just knew they had to run. It's not unusual for me to trek out on solo hiking day trips. For context, I'm a 31-year-old female. I frequently visit the nearby provincial parks that are generally well used. It's rare that I end up on a hike not seeing at least 1 or 2 people. I grew up going on camping and hiking trips and feeling very comfortable out in nature. I always inform people where I'm going and when I'm expected to be back. Safety first, right? One day last year I was going stir crazy, so I took myself out to a popular nature educational center. A bunch of trails stem from this one spot. They're not long trails, but are all interconnected, so it's easy to create your own distance. It was midweek, so I wasn't expecting to encounter many people. Maybe a school group at most. I grab my backpack, lock the car and head out. It was a beautifully sunny day, mid-autumn, so it was a little chilly out. I was listening to the sounds of nature surrounding me. Some squirrels, birds, even a deer crossed my trail at one point. I was sticking with the main trail, which had educational signs identifying the different types of plants as you went along. I've been trying to teach myself how to identify different trees on sight, so this path was the best. I made my way up to the first little hill and made my way down the path where it makes a sharp right turn. Up ahead, I caught sight of a man wearing a dark blue jacket. Strange. I hadn't seen any sign of the person or heard them, but whatever. Normally I am comforted seeing someone else, but this time my gut instinct was not happy. I made a note of which way the person went and continued along. Blue Jacket had taken the path I wanted to take to create a longer hike. It would have been a lot more secluded and less traveled, so for once I tried to be smart, listen to my gut, and just follow the main route back to my car. Keep it short and safe. I still had about 2 kilometers to get back to the parking lot. Clouds decided they wanted to skirt across the sky, making the woods a little dull and ominous. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling very unsettled. The trees cast finger-like shadows that did not help calm my imagination down at all. One of my favorite spots on this main trail had a few huge boulders and rock formations right smack in the middle that you had to go around. Really neat for photos and climbing on a normal day, but today they filled me with even more dread. I couldn't pinpoint why at first until I noticed some scuffs around the base of the rocks going the wrong way around. The trail is very obvious which way to go, left, and these marks were wrong. It was like someone walked around these rocks dragging their feet behind them. Animal? Perhaps. I couldn't figure it out. I wanted to turn around and go back the way I came, but that would have added another 4 kilometers to getting back to the car. I stuck close to the far side of the real path, keeping a close eye on the rock formation as I made it to the other side of the rocks. I caught sight of some blue fabric, the same blue jacket I saw earlier. The person moved as if ducking down between some rocks to avoid being seen. For Blue Jacket Man to reach the rocks before me, he either cut his own path through the woods or sprinted through about 5 to 6 kilometers of trails. I did not like the thought of either option, as I did not know this person and didn't want to know them at this point. Maybe he was taking a leak. Yeah, I'll go with that. I picked up my pace and dug my phone out. I texted my usual hiking friend, telling them all the details in case I suddenly went missing. Yes, I attempted to do this while following the path, and I only walked into one tree. I glanced behind me again while the rocks were still in sight, and saw the man standing there, staring at me. I ran the rest of the way back to my car, hopped in it immediately, locked the doors, and curiously there wasn't a single other vehicle in the parking area or the nearby road. This place was nowhere near any towns, so I have no clue where Mr. Blue Jacket came from. It took me a few minutes to sort myself out in the car, and as I pulled out to leave, I looked at the trail ahead. There was the damn Blue Jacket on a signpost. I had just passed it to get to my car. I was so spooked by this encounter that I refused to hike there alone ever again. Perhaps it was all an innocent misunderstanding, but my gut says otherwise. Back in September of 2013, I went to North Carolina with my husband, sister-in-law, mother-in-law and her fiancé, soon-to-be father-in-law, to attend my mother-in-law's wedding. We stayed in a very, very cute little cottage in the Smoky Mountains in Franklin, in a cute small neighborhood with decently spaced out houses swerving up a hill on the bottom side of a mountain. We spent a lot of time in Cherokee, at the reservation as well, which was relatively close if I remember correctly, but all of this happened back in Franklin. One evening we were all sat outside the front porch of the cabin decorating wine glasses with paint, while my father-in-law played the guitar. We noted how silent everything in the neighborhood was, no crickets, no birds, no wind. A little later my sister-in-law and mother-in-law went to bed early. and my father-in-law and husband were on the couch in the living room watching TV. I decided to go into the kitchen and make macaroni and cheese. The living room was right next to the kitchen entrance, and the couch my husband was on was the closest to the light switch to the kitchen. While I was draining the noodles, the light suddenly turned off on me. I yelled, "Hey!" and turned around and saw my father-in-law sleeping. I walked into the living room to see my husband sleeping as well. I said his name to wake him up and asked him why he turned the light off on me, thinking he was pulling a prank. He woke up and was visibly drowsy and said he didn't. I told him what happened, and my father-in-law woke up and heard what happened. Both my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were in their bedrooms still sleeping, and there's no way that they made it past me that fast and turned around as soon as the light went off, as I had a clear view of the living room entrance to the ground floor bedrooms, and the start of the stairs that lead to the upstairs bedroom. My father-in-law and husband came into the kitchen to investigate. We all looked at the light switch, which was in the off position, and my father tried messing with it to see if he could get it stuck in between on and off, to see if maybe that could have been the option. He couldn't get it to work. My husband told me to stop talking about it as they were both getting creeped out, and they both resumed watching TV. Even later that night, while I was sleeping with my husband and sister-in-law in the upstairs bedroom with the AC on, blaring on full blast, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream. I sat up and listened to it for a while and was surprised at just how loud it was, since I could hear it over the AC. I was pretty sure it was coming from outside, and I had to pee badly, so I slowly crept downstairs to the bathroom. I was able to hear the scream much more clearly from there. It was so horrifying I stood there in the bathroom in fear, and after I was done, shaking a little in fear, I realized it sounded like a woman in pure agony. It started out high and by the end got really low, and sounded like at the end of each scream she had to put up with something being ripped from her abdomen, as if each scream physically hurt. About an hour later, it was still going on, and it was only at that point where I gained the courage to go upstairs again. I tried waking my husband, but he's a very deep sleeper, and I had a hard time getting his attention. I knew if I'd have managed to wake him up, he would give me attitude and tell me half asleep he doesn't hear anything over the AC, and to just go back to bed. His sister is a lot like him when it comes to sleep, and she was still knocked out on the bed across the room. I gave up and tried to sleep it off. The bedroom we were in was in the attic. It had a door leading outside with a stairway leading down to the yard. When I was trying desperately to fall back asleep, I couldn't help but imagine a tall, skinny, lean, muscly being with very long limbs standing on the other side of the door. The image haunted me for quite a while, but I somehow managed to fall back to sleep. I don't think that I was necessarily seeing what the thing looked like. I'm just trying to express the amount of fear this thing gave me. I became far too afraid to wake anyone up to investigate whatever it was. I considered someone might be in danger, but it sounded too unreal, almost like it was something pretending to be human. For the past 6 years that happened, I've been trying to figure out what it was that I heard. I looked up YouTube videos of different animals screaming. Foxes, deer, mountain lions, you name it. Nothing was quite like what I heard. The closest thing was a mountain lion, but it would have had to have been a pretty large one on steroids, being an axe murderer or something. If anyone else has had a similar experience or is able to point me to a video with what they think it sounds like, I would appreciate it. There was a really creepy wooden figure of a duck in the living room of the cottage, but all its legs were painted red, and the red paint dripped down its unpainted legs, and its head was on backwards. It had a name tag on it that said, "My name is Melissa," and we all joked that it was trying to scare us. This story was told to me by a childhood friend's dad. Me and my friend had known each other for quite some time. Most of that time he lived in town. This town has a population of 8,000, literally in the dead center of Illinois. On the edge of town, on a country highway, there's the remnants of a small pig farm and slaughterhouse, which is now run down, the land of which his family used to hunt on since the 80s. Q are 8th grad year, and he tells me he's moving out to the country, to a new neighborhood that's being built, upscale homes, and his dad's been promoted at the local power plant. This was a mile from the farm/slaughterhouse. I start staying out at his house much more than usual, because it was awesome. Lots of money had gone into it. We would explore the woods during the day, and this was around 98 to 99, and we would spend the nights inside listening to music and messing around with Yahoo chat groups. One day out in the woods, we came across a pond of a decent size. There's a small island in the middle. My friend sees this and immediately goes pale, telling me we've got to leave. We hightail it out of there without waiting for me, and I follow. I keep asking what's going on, but he won't tell me. We finally return to his parents' house and are sitting in the kitchen when we come in through the garage. They see his face and ask him what's wrong. He tells his dad he found the pond. His dad looks sick, and I again ask what the hell is going on. Now, his dad is a pretty straight-laced fellow. Not really a sense of humor to speak of since I met him, and would only enjoy a glass of expensive whiskey when he was in the mood. He decides now is one of these moods. After getting his glass and taking a few sips, he makes us promise to stay away from there and tells us this story. When he was younger, his dad took him and his brother to hunt out there. This incident happened when he was 19 and well seasoned. They got out early and decided to set up by this pond. Slow day, only a few deer that weren't really worth anything. Starting to get the idea of a new spot, they heard a rustling from outside the pond across from them. It was a wolf, but those aren't here. Not a thing in our area. At least not capable of walking to the pond. Looking at it like it was investigating, then stood up on its hind legs, walked that way into the water, swam to the middle, but walked up to the island, on 2 legs, and it stood there before lying down, and seemingly fell asleep. They decided to wait to make sure it was out, then slowly backed away, getting back to the truck as quick as possible, never going to hunt back there again. Again, this was told to me quite some time ago, but it always stuck with me. My friend's dad never joked with us. He never seemed to have much of a sense of humor at all. This happened to me when I was 17, around the time when most of my friends were just getting their driver licenses. We all had that rush for cars back then, so it was quite common for us to skip school and go for a ride out of town. The city where I live is surrounded by forests and 2 mountains, so we basically had a lot of places to go and chill. One day my friend was very excited to show us a place that he found about online, which was reputed for being quite odd. We looked it up, and apparently it had a certain reputation for being a paranormal site. Being the typical group of teens, we collectively agreed to check it out ASAP, including me, who more or less believes in spiritual stuff. Going up the mountain, we were listening to the radio until we lost the station to static, which for obvious reasons is what the radios do when you go deep into the woods. This entire experience is happening during a summer night, so we were feeling pretty careless and as excited as a person can be. Having no music to listen to, we started talking and discussing our expectations for this place, with most of us having no expectation at all. Our conversation was suddenly interrupted by the loud static coming from the radio that we turned off just a few minutes ago. We were all a bit startled, but still nothing out of the ordinary. It happened again a few minutes later. We all looked at the radio and it was still off. We quickly dismissed it as something that radios do for some reason, and again didn't pay that much attention. The third time that it happened, the driver hit the brakes and stopped the car. He turned to us and yelled, "Did you hear that? What was that?" claiming that he heard a voice this time. None of us heard anything but static. The driver said he had had enough and switched the engine off, so there was no way for anything including the radio to be working. We sat like that for a while in pitch darkness, for there were no city lights around us and the forest had covered all the light sources like stars and stuff, so you couldn't distinguish a night sky from the canopy. That's how dark it was. The light indicating the radio turned on as soon as the static came, and I could tell we were all feeling a bit anxious by then. Through the static came a female voice singing, and it was very silent. For a second it got louder and then fell silent again and then vanished. But even weirder, the static vanished too. Once we switched the car back on and turned on the headlights, we observed what seemed to be smudges of fingers across the windshield. We didn't turn the car around immediately, but I could tell that we all just wanted to leave. We stopped further up on a hill, took some pictures of the Milky Way and went home. Ever since, we speculate what happened to the radio and windshield that night. My friends went twice more without me, recording the same including feeling, and a small push once the car was off. What do you think? I believe there are many logical explanations, but considering the fact that I'm a person who believes in this stuff and had an adrenaline rush that night, it's hard for me to grasp something rational. Me, my uncle and my grandfather are all avid outdoorsmen. We've heard it all, including bobcats during mating season, which if you haven't heard, sounds like a woman screaming. Quite honestly, this scared the crap out of me the first time I heard it when I was around 10, and honestly probably accounts for a lot of encounters that people claim to have out in the woods. As for my uncle, however, nothing ever phases him, and he's the most down-to-earth, no-nonsense outdoorsman I know, and has had many close encounters with black bears, bobcats, and even a cougar, and he always shares these tales with the younger kids at the bonfires. But one time he told me and my grandfather about something that he could not explain, something that chilled him straight to the bone, and made him question how much he really does know about the woods. Now this takes place deep in the Appalachian Mountains, west of Boone, but I don't know the exact spot, as he would never say. Him and his buddy Brian were backpacking, as they had done many times before. He had a larger group that did this sort of thing every year, but this time it was just the two of them. Now this trail they are on is miles from any road, much less residency, and is not the sort of trail you would encounter other hikers on. This is pure wilderness. A few days into the hike, they set up camp overnight next to a stream they were following, cooked dinner, and then turned in their tents for the night. Sometime later, my uncle was awoken by something outside their camp. He listened intently, although he wasn't alarmed. Perhaps they had left food out, and a bear or raccoon had wandered up to snatch a quick bite. He then noticed that whatever was outside the tent was big, really big, and he could feel the impact of its feet hitting the ground. By now he had grabbed his 44-point Magnum and laid it on his chest, just in case, of course. He still wasn't alarmed, as he had had many close encounters with bears before, and that's when he realized it. In the dead of the night there were no sounds, and the woods were oddly quiet, and he could hear the individual footsteps, and they were only two. Whatever was outside his tent was not walking on 4 legs, but 2. At this point he starts getting genuinely scared as the footsteps get closer and closer to the tent. He could now hear the heavy, raspy breaths of the creature, almost like a grunting sound that it took with each step. By now, his firearm was pointed right in the direction of the noise. He had no clue as to the height of the creature, but he could tell it was big, like a 300-pound man walking through his camp. And then he heard the creature simply slowly walk back into the woods going upstream, and heard the leaves rustle a bit as it entered back into the forest. And then the return of silence. Upon waking up the next day, he thought he may have dreamt it, when Brian came running up to him asking if he had heard whatever the hell was outside their camp that night. They immediately looked for tracks, but found nothing. The story doesn't end there, however. Sometime later they went backpacking again around the same area, although not exactly the same. They were all sitting around the campfire when they heard a pack of coyotes howling, which is not uncommon in that part of the state. They were listening to the symphony when out of nowhere came a deadening noise that echoed all through the valley. He described it as if a really big 200-pound muscular man had taken a baseball bat and slammed it against a tree as hard as he could. The forest immediately went silent, and not a single coyote howl or yip was heard again for the rest of the night. Now my uncle was dead serious when he was telling me this story, and isn't the type to make up stories to sound cool. It's really against his character, and I believed every word he said. My grandfather offered little to no insight as to what it could have been. As for me, it does sound a lot like the other Bigfoot stories I've read online, especially for knocking. What do you guys think? I'd love to hear your own ideas. Growing up, I had a neighbor who spent as much time with me as my own family. He also had a son a few years younger than myself, and we were all friends. They lived across the road from us. Behind their house was a heavily wooded ridge with an overgrown road going partially up it. At the end of this road was an old mobile home trailer from the 60s or 70s. It was captured by my neighbor's father, who was a state trooper during a drug raid, and was used as a hunting cabin for many years. At the time of this story, it was in a horrible state of repair, and by no means was probably safe to be in. My neighbor was utilizing it to store random stuff. So one night, I was over at their house as usual, and myself plus my neighbor's son was starting to get bored. At this point it was around 2 a.m. We decided to take the walk up to the trailer and sit there for a bit. So we gathered a flashlight and a small lantern, then headed up. At first things were uneventful. There was a light mist and rain, and it was a bit chilly but not that bad. We sat in the trailer amidst stored items and the decay of the place with the lantern for about 20 minutes, just hanging out and talking. We were discussing leaving when we heard footsteps outside. I have grown up in the woods, and the cadence or rhythm of steps people tend to make compared to animals is noticeable. These were human and heavy. We had heard nothing come up, nor had we seen anything on our way up. At this point, it made its way to the door of the trailer and stopped outside. We called and asked who was there, but there was nothing. No steps, no rustling, nothing. I, at least, had no inclination to be trapped there by anyone or anything, and picked up a rather heavy metal rod that happened to be there, and we whispered a plan. After a second, I kicked the door open with enough force to slam it against the trailer, and almost shut it again while my friend shone the light out. There was nothing there. No sounds of running, nothing at all. We gathered all our courage, hopped out and looked around for a minute. Still nothing to see nor hear. No footprints, no anything. We decided it was best at this point to take our asses back to the house, to which we did. We still didn't see or hear anything on the way back, and I don't know for sure what it was that we saw that night exactly. While hiking in Switzerland, I decided to see the Matterhorn, the famous mountain, up close. So I left the village I was staying in early, Zermatt, and walked through meadows, hills, and then up the mountain to reach the plateau. Early in the morning, after just having left the town, I walked the straight path, past some houses on the left, the town behind me, the mountain ahead, and forests on the right. In front of the forests, there were few curious old huts on stilts, the ones that require you to climb by ladder. They were all made of round planks and soot black. My imagination immediately thought of witch huts, out of all the movies and media that I'd consumed. They seemed closed, not to mention I didn't really want to get in them. So I kept walking. I saw the mountain, met some people, had lunch in the afternoon, and then decided to walk back to town. I remembered the way and backtracked pretty much exactly. On my way back, the mountain was behind me, town ahead, houses and meadows on the right, and the dark, spooky huts on the left, guiding the entrance, leading to the forest. I should note that despite checking out the huts in the morning, I didn't notice there was a forest path behind them. Curious about it, I checked the wooden road sign placed in the vicinity of the huts. To my surprise, the one pointing in the direction of the woods said Zermatt, but the one pointing to where I was originally coming from in the morning said the name of another town, Furry. I was very confused. I looked back and looked again, thinking that maybe my brain was playing a trick on me, but I kept seeing what I saw. I stood there while few hikers passed in each direction, and they all stayed on the main path. Nobody went into the forest or looked at the road signs. I sat there in front of the huts and smoked a cigarette, and thought whether I should go into the forest, and why the signs showed such strange directions. I wondered if there was a reason I should go in, but I was already very tired to the point my legs were feeling weak. So I opted to go the way I came from, to trust my gut, and to take the most main path back to town. When I stood up, the signs were different. There was no way anyone could have rearranged them, no wind, no human. It was there the whole time, and the only people who walked by didn't stop at the signs, let alone to tinker with them. I told this story to my friend in Zermatt, and he just laughed at the idea of paranormal entities trying to lure me into the forest. I was fortunate enough to grow up on a lovely little secluded piece of land in Canada. I had a large house which was backed by beautiful forests and woodland. I never wanted much in the way of entertainment, as myself and my brother Gabriel had plenty of games to play in the dense forest, which kept us busy for most of the day. I was homeschooled and spent a lot of my time in and around that forest, and grew to love it and know it like the back of my hand. My family is not very spiritual. My dad was an atheist, my mother a very casual Catholic. I think I might have gone into church twice in my life. Despite this, Dad didn't like us going deep into the forest. Mum, much the same. They said it had funny vibes, some gut instinct, I guess. They didn't have a problem with me and Gabe going into the forest, as long as we were sensible, were together, and did not go in too deep. We had enough of a feel for what was too deep to never cause a problem by venturing too far and getting lost or anything. But we would often still push into the woods a bit to explore new areas. There were some nights where I would be woken up by blue flashes coming through my window, as if someone taped cellophane over a flashlight and was sporadically turning it off and on from above the canopy deep in the woods. Other nights, if the wind carried just right, you could hear voices in the dead of night. Sometimes conversations, sometimes wailing or shouting. Other times, whispers, sometimes all three. I could never really hear what was being said. The woods stretched out for kilometers, and to my knowledge was uninhabited, where the lights and noises came from. On one particular occasion the activity climaxed. I was about 14. Me and Gabe wandered further than we ever had. We reached a point, and it was like something snapped. It was hard to describe. It was like the feeling you get when you break something, and you know you're about to get caught. We turned back pretty quickly. I think something followed us out of the woods. A few hours later, I was reading in the living room, which had a big glass sliding door that faced the backyard and trees. That is when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A humanoid dude, probably 6 feet tall, was beckoning me from the tree line. He had wild, untamed hair, sickly, hairless skin, and didn't appear clothed. He just kept on beckoning, with this awkward, stiff movement of his arm. There was something totally off about him. I screeched for my dad, and when I did, the guy walked behind the nearest tree and vanished out of sight. I explained to my dad what I saw and looked outside, but found nothing. He told me I probably imagined something from my book. I know I definitely did not. I am an East Tennessee native and have grown up going to the Smokies. I have also had a strange or seemingly paranormal experience while in the area. So my grandparents own a bunch of rental properties and cabins in Townsend and surrounding the Smokies for holidays, etc. And my extended family would always gather together at these cabins for the holidays. I'd had little things happen here and there, like feeling watched while playing in the woods growing up with my brothers and cousins, or hearing strange inhuman-sounding noises outside at night where there weren't any animals or predation, as I'm very aware and educated on the local wildlife of the Smokies, but nothing super substantial or scary enough that I actually experienced true terror or fear. Mostly just weird little things here and there. Some things being knocked off a table in the cabin or bumps in the night. Anyway, one Christmas around 2010, me and my twin brother were given a cabin to ourselves for the weekend, within a half-mile or so from the rest of the family cabins, and my grandparents' main cabin. We are both 19 at this point, so not little kids by any means. First night there, we drink and I fell asleep early downstairs on the couch, and he passes out in the upstairs bedroom loft. No big deal. Next night he's asleep on the couch, and I'm upstairs in the loft laying in bed. I begin getting the feeling of being watched. Like, not just the little paranoia feeling. It starts off and it builds up to the point where I'm almost in full-blown panic. Now I'm a 20-year-old male at this point, and keep telling myself that I'm just being a coward, and the gut feelings are ridiculous. But the feeling persists. I'm now wide awake looking around the cabin in the pitch darkness for something. I keep seeing movement from the corner of my eye, and just like that, all of a sudden it becomes completely silent, like the Oz effect or whatever other people have called it. I'm laying there, heart pounding, when I hear something whisper in my ear. When I say whisper, it was in a raspy, drawn-out tone, but was still startling loud, as if someone was leaning over the bed directly above me, saying it into my ear. I jumped up, went downstairs, and fell asleep on the floor beside my brother on the couch, scared like a little kid. We woke up next morning, and my brother was extremely surprised to find me down there with him, but didn't say anything or ask any questions. As to why, I was curled up beside them on the couch. Within a year later, around Halloween, we were talking with some family and friends about strange experiences, and out of nowhere, my brother says to everyone, "Yeah, I definitely think Grandpa's cabins in the Smokies are haunted or something," and goes on to talk about how he had this same weird feeling the night before I slept upstairs in the loft. He's feeling watched, panicked, and all the same feelings as me. He, like myself, couldn't really even verbalize the feeling of being watched by something malicious well. I kinda yell in excitement about having the same gut feeling there, but that's when he realizes the reason the next night why I was asleep on the floor next to him, but afterwards I did confide in him embarrassingly. I might add that to this day I have no idea what happened in those cabins. My grandparents sold them all and we haven't been back. It was strange and weird. My personal opinions is that something to do with the energy from the mountains, the energy from the Native Americans who lived there for centuries before us. I believe the entity that spoke to me was purely malicious. I was at my girlfriend's house for the weekend, which is usually every Friday to Sunday, and in of itself isn't that unusual. We both recently started college. She still lives with her parents and 2 younger brothers. It was about 4:50 in the morning, and this is when the creepy stuff began. You see, everyone else in the house was asleep, except for us. We love staying up late to play video games or watch films. We just finished watching a movie, in fact, and were preparing to go to sleep. I was getting changed into shorts and a shirt to sleep, and my girlfriend went to the kitchen to get us both a glass of water, since her room can get very hot and stuffy during the summer. After getting changed, I was chilling on the beanbag in her room, waiting for her to return. At this point, it's important to understand the basic layout of where she lives, otherwise this next part might be slightly confusing. So her house is about 8 minutes outside the city limits, and she has a long driveway that goes from the road up a hill that leads to her house. Her house is surrounded by trees and fairly dense forest, and her nearest neighbors are a good couple of minutes away. At the end of her driveway is a motion sensor that, when activated by movement, then makes 3 loud beeps inside her home. Her dad is a fairly high-ranking military man, so he definitely takes precautions and safety measures to ensure his family's safety. And like I said before, she was in the kitchen alone at around 4 a.m, while I am still in her bedroom. Her kitchen is down the hallway and through the living room from where her bedroom is, so she should be back within a minute or 2. She was just taking at least triple the usual amount of time, and right before I was going to head into the kitchen to check on her, she walked around the corner with a worried look on her face. She can be spooked pretty easily, so I wasn't alarmed at first. She handed me the water and then started to explain quickly why she had taken so long. She'd pretty much said that she was in the kitchen, in the sink, filling up the water, when she heard a whining sound coming outside the 2 windows near the sink. She figured it was one of her 2 dogs and decided to go to the garage to check on them. They were both curled up in their kennels when she opened the door, asleep, and had only just been woken up by her turning on the light to see them. She told me at that point she was pretty confused and slightly uneasy. She walked back into the kitchen and heard this really deep, weird bark coming again from somewhere outside the kitchen windows. And please note that it was 4 a.m, so it's nearly pitch black outside, especially since the dense trees around their house block up plenty of moonlight. She told me she couldn't see anything and hurried back to the room to tell me. I was slightly skeptical at first, since I assumed it was just the dogs and that my girlfriend was really tired and tripping out, so I agreed to follow her back to the kitchen. At first I heard nothing for a good 2 minutes and decided to try and recreate what she had done. I walk in, turn on the sink and wait. Another 2 minutes go by and I hear the same freaky whining sound coming from outside the window. It sounded so much like a wounded animal. I had to turn on the lights on the garage again, which was slightly lighting up the area outside the window, but I couldn't see a sign of animals or anything. She switched off the light, and then we heard the whining sound grow further away, almost as if the creature had fled up the hill near the kitchen and towards the forest. That was when we realized that it was scared or sensitive to the lights, so we left the kitchen and returned to her room. At this point I was pretty spooked, and I wanted to make sure that whatever it was had been scared off for good. So we go back into the kitchen, and after a few minutes, both armed with decently sized knives that my girlfriend has in her room for protection. 5 minutes go by in the kitchen, and it's silent. But then the whining starts up again, and a weird, sad barking sound, like something imitating an injured animal, was maybe 10 feet outside the kitchen windows. And at that moment I realized something. There's no reason for some creature to try and imitate an injured animal's sound unless it wanted to lure us out and cause us harm. I get slightly annoyed at it and start to yell at it to go away, and everything falls silent. Then I hear movement outside the window and a weird sound, almost as if something was moving alongside the wall right under the window. Then, whatever it was lets out this unnatural sound, almost like a groan and a growl. My girlfriend and I looked at each other and sprinted out the kitchen without a word. We hid in her room until we passed out at 5 or 6 a.m. We had talked it over, listened to a ton of animal noises, and not a single one got anywhere close to the final unnatural sound. I wouldn't even be able to accurately mimic the sound. It was so eerie and haunting, and I can still hear it in my head. So we did some research the next day, and there are a few known possibilities that we came up with. Perhaps a Wendigo, Skinwalker, I don't know, maybe even something else. We looked around outside in the morning, and there was no blood and no tracks, so definitely no injured animal. However, on the hill about 10 feet in front of the kitchen window, we saw 2 heavy indents on the ground and then flattened grass leading up. We decided to tell one of my girlfriend's brothers about this experience so that he could help test something. We had one person go inside the kitchen sink near the windows and the other walk around in various places near the windows making sounds to try and triangulate where the creature had been standing. We concluded it was at one point no more than 5 feet from the windows, and then at another point it fled up the hill, which matched with the trampled grass and indents leading up the hill. Farther up the hill there's a path that branches, and another part of the path is fairly abandoned and overgrown. Nobody has walked there in at least 2 years, and I followed it to the end and kept going a little further looking for tracks. I did manage to find something interesting. A 3-foot-tall fern and brambles almost completely flattened, and a few twigs snapped perfectly in half as if something decently large had walked through the area in a hurry, and it seemed very recent. We then decided to tell my girlfriend's parents about it, and her dad seemed especially interested in it. He told us that the wood panels on the pump house had been torn off within the last few days. He then took one of the dogs into the woods, and we assume he checked for any signs. He returned and about 2 days later installed a camera right next to the kitchen window where we heard the sounds. And again, he's a pretty high-ranking military man, and he 100% believes that there was something going on that night. If anyone has any thoughts or input, I'd appreciate it. Before I get to this story, I'd like to point out that I'm not from America, which is surprisingly in contrast to what people often think. I'm from the Netherlands, and due to the kind of mentality I was raised with, I would have never even dared to think about the existence of supernatural creatures here. Personally, I've always been on the fence about these kind of things, unsure what stories are legends and just superstitions, and which ones hold more truth than fantasy. The typical Dutch mentality I've been raised with is that there's nothing more to the world than what we've already discovered, at least not in terms of the divine, the paranormal, and the supernatural. At least, that's what I had originally thought. But as it often does, the world tends to show us her truths in one form or another. I was born in Holland, the Midwest of the country, but moved to Brabant, the Middle South, at a young age. There's nothing out of the ordinary about my home, but I'm happy to say there's quite a big forest just a few kilometers south of where I live. I'd often, and still do, go on long walks and relaxing hikes there. I would often go off trail occasionally and go on nightly walks in the summer, all illegally, since here we have strict laws that say nobody is allowed to either camp, go off trail, or be in the forest at night. Needless to say, I deliberately stayed in the forest until after sunset, secretly risking a fine. I'd often wear dark clothes to go out into the forest, so that the service men and women, and the late-night lurkers, would be unable to spot me. I don't know why I'm addicted to these hikes in the forest, especially the nocturnal ones. I've always felt a really strong call of the wild, since the first time I went off trail in the summer of 2017, when I'd visit the woods either going off trail or not. Not even the time of day would matter. I'd get energetic and excited about it. I would even dare to say that I wanted to go hunting at some point, when I'd see a deer or rabbit nearby. Unfortunately, I don't have a license or the weapons, so I'm pretty sure I wouldn't catch anything. Anyway, months ago at the start of autumn, I went for another night hike in the forest. I had to bring my flashlight since it was cloudy and rainy outside. As always, I went there on my mountain bike, chaining it to a pole before I'd set off into the darkness between the trees. I saw just the last people walking back to their cars and homes, as I was walking in the opposite direction. It was getting completely dark when I reached the middle point of the forest. You can call me a hippie, I don't mind. Frankly, I would have done so myself if I'd read a similar story. Now, before I get to the actual encounter, I must say that I have already encountered something similar in the woods of January of 2017. I went to the forest during the day since the winter's first snow had fallen during the night, and I wanted to go and take some photographs of the beautiful snowy landscape. Though I stayed a bit too long, it had gotten dark and I'd had to be back at my bike and out the woods. So hurrying back is when I heard a loud crunch coming from the bushes, as if something big, like a deer, was running along the trees. The sound was distant at first, but soon it got closer, until indeed I did see a deer speed out of the snow, covered depths of the forest across the path I was on. Though, hot on its heels, raced something different. This huge, wolf-like creature, clearly bigger than a regular wolf. This one was at least a meter high at the shoulder. It looked slightly sturdier than a regular timber wolf, with dark, shaggy fur looking at its face. I could see its teeth and its paws. They were much larger to that of a normal wolf. Now please note that back in 2017, wolves were only just returning to the Netherlands, mostly roaming the border with Germany, and eventually settling in our biggest national park, which was located more than 100 kilometers away from my place. Plus, there hadn't been any wolves spotted in this area yet, so it was pretty much impossible for me to believe this was just an ordinary wolf. Only looking at the sheer size of it already. I would have taken a picture of it if only I could have. Everything happened so fast. I saw the deer and the wolf cross the trail within a time span of 5 seconds at most before they vanished into the dark. Still awestruck and a little unsettled by now, knowing there was a huge canine roaming the woods, I went over to look at possible tracks it might have left behind. It did, but with every gallop it must have kicked up lots of dirt in the air, since there were no paw prints, only claw marks, and then patches of dirt missing. Though those marks were still as big as my hand with my fingers spread out. Feeling frightened and still processing that I'd just seen a gigantic wolf hunt down its prey, I marched over to my bike as fast as I could, unlocked it, jumped on it, and rode away, before it decided to change its mind and make me its meal instead. That's when I heard a sinister deep howl coming from the woods. Like a wolf's howl, but in some way deeper and more haunting. Of course I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, especially since I didn't have enough evidence to support my claim. But I wasn't afraid of going back to the woods, not even at night, since I knew wolves generally aren't afraid of humans, and when I did go back, by the time of my second encounter, I'd almost forgotten about the beast that calls the forest its home. The summer of 2019, I returned for a nightly walk after having done the occasional hikes during the day. I didn't bring my camera with me this time. I just wanted to go for a refreshing full moon walk. After about half hour of walking deep into the woods, and after having set myself down on a wooden bench, I heard the faint bleating of a sheep from about 300 meters away. I stood up and started to go in the direction of the noise, mostly because the bleating sounded rather distressed, as if the sheep were panicking or trying to flee from something. I was already surprised that I could hear it from so far away, but what surprised me more was that I was able to smell something metallic as well. It was like a coppery scent, very strong, and that's when I figured it must be the smell of blood. The wind was blowing in my direction, but still I didn't know I was capable of this. The flock was placed on a small moor about 300 meters from where I was seated on the bench. It took me some time walking towards the pen before I could see the sheep, as they were hidden by trees and bushes. When I arrived at the pen, something unexpected shocked me. Not only were the animals running around frantically and trying to escape, but there had been 2 sheep slaughtered lying there in a puddle of blood, their throats torn open by powerful jaws and ferocious claws, judging from the looks of the deep gashes in the skin and bite marks on their neck. There were a scramble of enormous lupine paw prints around the sheep's corpses and around their makeshift enclosure. It seemed as if the killer was meticulous about choosing its prey before stepping inside to make a move. After the victims had been selected, the results were clear to see. This monstrous beast threw caution to the wind, just as it had done to the sheep's innards. To most it was a horrendous sight, but I found it more curious than anything else. The first thing I felt was frustration, that something was roaming around the woods near my home. I followed the tracks, hoping to find what made them before whatever it was found me. As I got deeper into the woods, the foliage became denser and harder to navigate. It was just that dark. Thinking quickly, I turned on my flashlight and shone it around the shadows cast by the moonlight, creating eerie shapes and figures. Suddenly, I heard muffled footsteps from around me. A branch snapped from behind me, and without thinking, I shone my light towards where I'd heard it. Dark yellow eyes about 4 feet above the ground reflected back at me from the shadows. As soon as the beast had stepped out from the cover of the shadows, and when I came face to face with it, I froze. It was, from a few quick looks of it, the same animal I'd seen 2.5 years ago. It had the same build, the same dark shaggy fur. The animal appeared to be staring at me cautiously, its gaze hard and cold, but it didn't seem to be aggressive. From the blood on its snout, I could tell that this must have been the beast that killed those sheep, and now I was indeed scared, on the edge, and cautious. It's not like I stood much of a chance against a wolf like this, with its huge teeth and claws, but my instincts told me to fight rather than flee if need be. After all, if I ran, I'd pretty much give myself away as prey for the animal if it was still hungry. Plus, these woods were mine, and the beast was an intruder, and I'd be damned if I let an intruder trespass on my home. The beast was still watching me, and as it did so, it rose onto its hind legs. Thankfully, no signs of aggression were visible. Despite that, I took a defensive stance, broadening my shoulders and appearing as big as I possibly could. The creature approached. It was now standing about 5 meters away, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand as it bowed forward a little, sniffing the air. It then perked up its ears, twitched them about, as if it was reconsidering going after me. And despite how standoffish I chose to appear, and how I may act in my day-to-day life, I couldn't even come close to how intimidating and well-built this thing was, how large it was, and when compared to, well, how minuscule I am, I shrank inside. The wolf stepped back, breaking eye contact as it sniffed the air and looked around. I took a tiny step forward, attempting to scare it off, as I once again tried to look as defensive and territorial as I felt in that moment. I decided to take my chances. It was now or never, so breathing in deeply and with my most intimidating voice I shouted, "Get out now." In Dutch, of course. The beast acted surprised, startled even, as if it hadn't even expected me to speak or be this defensive. It then let out a growl, and after that it got down on all fours and vanished into the foliage. Soon as I could no longer see or hear it, I let out a sigh of relief so loud that I was still afraid. That thing could hear me, and worse, it could return. My feet had gone numb as the adrenaline left my body, and I was quaking as the cold air finally started to nip at me. A loud, distant howl echoed from behind me, and as it rang through the night, the fear grew inside me. It howled again, and I started to head back to my bike, swiftly jogging for what seemed like hours, continuously checking every sound I heard, keeping my eyes wide open, like a startled deer, and never failing to look around me in case the monster had other plans. After making it back to my bike, I quickly unlocked it and raced home, breaking what must have been the world's record for fastest speed pedaled, and once I arrived, the realization hit me that I had very likely been staring death in the face. It made yet another cold shiver go down my spine. To relax, I had a drink, sat down on the couch, and as I sat down with a drink in hand, staring into the fireplace, the questions started pouring at me. Why didn't it attack me? Why did it leave? Stranger still, how is something that big? Not to mention how it hasn't been reported in the local news. How has no one caught it on camera? And if they have, were they silenced by the media? Were they laughed at, mocked, ostracized? I had all these questions, but no way of finding any answers. Moreover, was it even what I thought it was? Was the creature perhaps a dire wolf of some kind that was only thought to have gone extinct in prehistoric times? There had to be a logical explanation after all. Time moved on, weeks became months, and I never told a soul about my encounter. Since then, cattle mutilations have been reported. Strange and large animal tracks have been documented. People say it's a bear or a ravenous pack of wolves, but these stories only come up the night after a full moon, they say. There have even been multiple reportings of sheep massacres around the south and east of the country that have been confirmed to have been committed by a wolf. I've been back to these woods since, but only in the day. But even then, I still felt off, like I was being watched and unwelcome. My two encounters did make me dive into Dutch and European folktales and legends about werewolves. And to summarize what I found, European timberwolves are said to have been the most bold and aggressive in the world. All I can say for certain is that no matter how unbelievable it sounds, always give a little bit of trust towards the old stories you're told, because you may just be encountering something straight out of fantasy, only to leave your survival, your life to fate. And if you should ever find yourself in the Netherlands, especially in the woods on a full moon at night, you best hope that thing you hear howling off in the distance is a lot further than you think to be, because there's no telling what might happen if the two of you meet. Good luck, and have a good night. I've lived in a small town in Kentucky for my entire life, and because of that, I've been surrounded by the mountains and the woods for years. My current house is literally nestled into the woods in the middle of nowhere, and thus outdoor activities have taken up a large chunk of my time, especially in the summer and fall. I'm in the woods almost daily, hiking to the creeks to fish or meadows to hunt, and I know the woods and trails around my home like the back of my hand. That said, there is definitely something that calls you while you're in the woods, especially when you're alone, and I've just now realized it after stumbling upon these kind of stories. My parents began allowing me to hike alone when I was around 13. But I didn't get really into it until about 2 years later when I was 15. Even then, though I wasn't allowed to go very far, I always had to carry a walkie-talkie with me so I could contact my family if necessary. Later at 17, I'd be allowed to carry a firearm with me, but that was neither here nor there. There's stories I can tell you at that age too, but this one takes place when I was 50. I should also mention, I have 2 outside dogs, Max, a black Labrador, and Bo, a beagle. I've had both since I was very young, and they're super smart, always staying by my side when I'm in the woods, and they always listen to me until this day. I was hiking a trail that runs up beyond my aunt's house, one that I'd hiked day in, day out, just out and about enjoying the woods. It was in October, so the weather was cool, not hot, and I had been hiking for around an hour. The trail comes out on a spring that runs down from the top of this particular mountain. It hadn't rained lately, so the spring was mostly dry and covered in leaves. I remember looking up the mountain, which I'd never hiked to the top of before, and feeling this strange call. It wasn't really a voice, but it was an urge I couldn't ignore. Keep in mind that I'm a very timid person, and hiking unfamiliar trails on my own freaks me out to this day. But that day, all my fear had dissipated. All thought left my head. I just climbed higher and higher, my dogs following me. I don't even know how to describe the feeling that came over me, but I remember just staring down at my feet and feeling at peace as I climbed. There was a moment when I paused to look out at the houses below. I'd never been that high, remember, and I felt amazed. I looked at a picture on my phone and then looked around for my dogs. Bo had already run off and Max was following. I called out to them frantically to stop, but they wouldn't listen. They vanished. At this point, I looked down the mountainside and was very afraid. Then I looked back uphill, and it came over me again. I kept hiking. I couldn't stop. Eventually I heard my walkie-talkie crackle. Everything was distorted, and I couldn't make any of the words out. I assume now that I was just out of range for it to pick up, but back then it freaked me out. Whatever had come over me lost its hold on my mind. My dogs were still gone. Panicked, I began running downhill. It's a wonder I didn't get hurt. As I neared the wide section of the spring near the bottom, my walkie-talkie picked back up, and I heard my dogs running downhill behind me. I got home and mostly forgot about it. I just told myself I had almost been lost and had to be more careful. Fast forward to many years later, and I still hike. At this point, Max is very old and no longer hikes with me, so it's just Bo. Last year I hiked up to a cave behind my house, as I've done so many times before. And then I started following a trail I'd never fully explored just out of curiosity. Bo was ahead of me as usual, but when I called her back, she'd come. We hiked for the better part of 45 minutes, following a pretty simple trail, and then I figured I'd better be heading back, because it'd be getting dark soon. And yet I couldn't stop. I kept telling myself I'd just go a little bit further, just to see a little bit more. And I remember looking down at my feet, just like before, and listening to the silence of the woods around me, and feeling at peace. It felt so easy to just keep going deeper, and so difficult to turn around. Bo felt the call too, because even after I did break out of it and turn around, only after stumbling on a root, and then called back to her, she wouldn't stop. I had to catch up with her physically, turn her around and pet her before she'd come to me. I don't know what you will make of all of this. What if I hadn't stumbled over that route? Or what if my mum hadn't decided to contact me at that moment? How deep would I have hiked? And what would have waited for me in those depths? I don't know what's out there, but I know this. The woods call. call to us all. Context. I was 17 when this happened. I'm female, and spoilers, I'm a lot more savvy now than I used to be. I was 17, and had just started a relationship with a guy who I thought was the world. Turns out he cheated on me several times and was no good for me. My parents warned me off. They told me he was a loser and a bum. You see, he was 27, so a lot older than me, had dropped out of high school, and had pretty much been homeless for a long time. He and I met through mutual friends at a party, and we really hit it off, and I thought he was the love of my life. Oh, to be 17. In any case, he told me to run away from home, that my parents didn't understand our love, and that we should be free to do whatever we pleased. It didn't matter that I was still going to school. He convinced me with his sweet words, and off I ran. We were gone for about 3 weeks when this happened. Life had already started to seem quite bleak. Being homeless was nowhere near as glamorous as he made it out. Sleeping rough, having to struggle for food, and he rinsed the little money I had in my bank account relatively quickly. He told me of a cabin that he knew, right near the edge of the woods. He said that he had rented it off the owner before, and that they went way back. I, totally smitten, agreed with the proposal. It would be nice to have a roof over our heads. Truth be told, I was starting to miss my parents, but I was still blindsided by love. He took me to the cabin, which was about a 4-hour walk, and when we finally got there, it was heaven compared to how rough I'd been sleeping. To think I'd finally be able to shower. We got there. It was lovely. The only problem was that we didn't have a key. He told me that the guy had left it somewhere for us to find, but hadn't specified, and since he'd only contacted him through a payphone, as he didn't have a cell phone, well, then there weren't many options. We started rummaging around the little path that led up, checking for fake rocks, under rocks, in bushes, buried in mud, and all the like. We looked for about 2 hours, and I was starting to get less and less convinced that this was true, and getting angry at my boyfriend for this. But he told me not to worry and that we will find it soon. He really did have a way with words. I grew tired of looking for the key, and went and looked at the house itself, did a perimeter check, and found that one of the upstairs windows was a little bit open. If I stood on my boyfriend's shoulders, I might be able to just touch it and crawl in perhaps. Well, after falling down twice, I just about managed to prop it open with a stick and climb my way in. It was plenty big enough for me to go through, which I was very grateful for. The cabin itself was simple enough. I got in on the upstairs part, let's call it the attic I suppose, of the cabin. It was a very nice bedroom, and I made my way down and unlocked the door. One of the things I realized when I got down is that it had 2 different locks, so even if we would have found one key, we still wouldn't have been able to get in. I was wondering at this point if my boyfriend's testimony was true. But, trying to think the best of him, I unlocked the door and let him inside. We spent a really comfortable few days in the cabin. It was absolutely charming, just to be at one with nature. He was into yoga and a whole host of other interesting things as well, and at one point when he went out to get the green stuff, I was left there by myself, just trying to relax and calm down. While I was waiting all alone, as my boyfriend had already been about 3 hours at this point, I started looking around and found a book. I perched myself in the little living area on a chair and started reading, feeling quite happy with myself. That's when I see a car pull into the driveway. A really nice fancy looking car too. 4 people get out of the car. They all look about 25 to 30, with an assortment of camping and trekking gear. They start opening the door with keys, and when they open it, I give them a funny look and ask them what they think they're doing. They give me an equally puzzled look and ask me the same thing. At this point, there was no genuine confrontation, but I was starting to get afraid. But, confident that my boyfriend hadn't lied to me, and that he had in fact booked the cabin, I told them that we had booked the cabin for the week, and that my boyfriend knew the owner, and that there must be a mistake with their reservation. They told me that they had just received the keys from the owner himself, who lived about a mile away, and that there was no way he'd already booked it out. He was some 40-year-old guy, no way his memory was falling apart just yet. We gave each other quizzical looks. The guy asked where my car was, and I, not wanting to sound like I had walked here, told him that my boyfriend had gone out in the car and that he'd be back shortly. I didn't really know what else to say from embarrassment. So, with a defeated look, he said, "Come on, get in my car and we'll drive down to the owner and see him." At this point I was about soiling myself. As the confidence of these guys grew, I started to get more and more confident that my boyfriend was perhaps full of garbage and had lied to me completely, and that we had broken in and used the resources of someone else's cabin, and the guilt was weighing me down. I told him that wouldn't be necessary, that I would go speak to the owner myself when my boyfriend got here, and that perhaps we were assigned another cabin, and were given this one by mistake. That was quick thinking on my part. I didn't even know if there were any more, but the guy kind of shrugged it off and asked if in the meantime they could set up, as he was fairly confident that they were going to use this cabin. So I said sure, went upstairs and gathered our small 2 tattered backpacks and came back down. It was awkward and uncomfortable reading the book there, and at that moment is when I hear laughter coming from down the hill. I jump out the door and see my boyfriend and a few of his homeless buddies coming up. Looks like they were coming to stay as well. They had a lot of their stuff, one of them pulling a duvet behind him. When he gets to the top, he sees the car and asks where it came from. I told him that some guys were here to rent the cabin, and sweetly said that we should go check with the owner, who lives only a mile away, to see what the mix-up was about. He gives me a deadpan look and says that there must have been a mistake and la la la. That's when I catch him out. I could tell in his eyes that he had no idea that this was already rented out by someone else, and that he had basically forced me to go in and break into a cabin. I was mortified. He tells me that we'll be fine and starts leading me down the hill and tells me that there's another cabin and there must have been a mix-up. I grab my backpack, very upset. But there was something off about my boyfriend. It was like the fact that I had challenged him that had really irritated him. Him and his buddies were starting to display a lot more bravado than usual, and I was getting uncomfortable. They were telling nasty jokes, saying nasty words and calling me names, all banterously, apparently. That's when they got to a little brook. My boyfriend then looked at me dead in the eyes and slapped me in the face. I was shocked. No one had ever hit me like that before. Just when I was about to say what I thought of him and give him a piece of my mind, did I feel 2 hands push me square in the chest, and I fell straight, backpack and all, into the brook. He said that I should never speak to him that way, and called me all manner of horrible things. Said that I needed to learn my lesson, and him and his buddies laughed heartily and walked further into the woods. I dragged myself out of the water, crying, clueless as to where I was and where they'd gone, with little intention of following them. So I did the only logical thing. I went up to the cabin and spoke to the guys who were in there, told them the truth, that I'd run away from home, that my homeless boyfriend was a piece of work who I was pretty much done with now, and that I really would appreciate a ride home as I had no idea where I was or what I was doing. I was lucky enough that the girlfriend gave me a lift home. Turns out I was only 40 minutes away, lucky for me. My parents gave her money for gas and a little extra and thanked her when I got home safe. Something important to note is that I had actually left my cell phone in the house, as I didn't want to be part of my parents' system or use anything they had given me, other than clothes, when I left with him. That was part of his doing. I'm glad to say that I learnt my lesson about going and getting in with the wrong crowd, and my life has gone pretty well since then. One thing, I never saw him again, but I did read about him in the local paper a few years back. He apparently had gotten into a lot of trouble with some dangerous people and was on the run, and his mugshot was also available in some shops for petty theft. Looks like he never straightened out. Shame, really. I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains, very close to Stone Mountain State Park. I'm an avid hiker and have hiked many miles in these mountains. There is a large number of granite boulders at the base of this mountain, some as big as a small cabin. They have always been fascinating to me, and when you enter the wooded area, where the boulders are, there is an eerie quiet seemingly void of wildlife. This happened last year while hiking with my boyfriend and our dogs. We had seen a couple of the waterfalls that day, and were going to hike to the lower falls. There had been very heavy rain for a few days, and I knew this trail had several creek crossings. I decided I didn't want to get wet, and told my boyfriend to go on without me and that I would wait. The falls were only another half mile or so ahead. My boyfriend and the dogs go on the creek and then disappear out of my line of sight. As soon as I couldn't see them anymore, I was suddenly aware of how quiet the woods were. There were no birds chirping, or squirrels rustling leaves. I don't usually get spooked, but all of a sudden, I had this overwhelming sense of dread. I felt as if something was watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I had an urge to run after my boyfriend and started the creek crossing when I saw him come dashing back towards me. He too had an overwhelming sense of dread, and didn't get 10 minutes down the trail before he turned back and ran to me. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to attack me. And this was at 11 a.m. on a summer's day, so not very big cat or bear kind of time. The next incident was very scary because I was alone with our dog. We were hiking the same section of Stone Mountain, but a different trail called Wolf Rock. On the way up I had seen many trees that were scorched, but that could have been due to lightning. I started getting an ominous feeling, so started picking up the pace to head back. When I was about a mile from my car, I heard what can only be described as a supersonic boom. It shook the ground and rattled the trees. It spooked me and my dog so badly, we ran most of the way back to the car. Later I tried describing the sound to my boyfriend to no avail, since I've never heard anything like it. Not gunfire, not a plane, not a rock slide, which I've all heard before. But while reading another person's story, it sparked my memory. They described the sound like that of a giant sledgehammer hitting a tin wall. That's the best way I can describe the noise I heard. That metallic bang reverberating through the woods was very unsettling. In July 2015, my family and I took our motorhome out to the Oregon-California coast. We go here as much as we can, and we hike the redwood forest trails to Crescent City, California, at least once in the week. My friend went along with us this trip. She and I decided to leave my husband and my in-laws to to a quiet afternoon and take my rambunctious boys on a hiking trail. We were going to go on one we always did, but there are so many people all around us, so we chose to take a new one. As we were hiking, my kids were going up and back a bit, and I was scolding them for getting too far ahead of me, and that they could fall and I needed to be close. They would back up a bit and then do it again, much like any child. We'd gone about a mile, passing people along the way when we came to a bridge. There was a guy who was stopped at the end of it, and I don't know what exactly gave me this weird feeling at first, but I collected my boys close to me as we came nearer. He was just staring at us without blinking. My friend came up behind us and happened to snap a faraway picture of the encounter. As we reached the end of the bridge, I had all my kids with me, and he was just staring. Then he looked at me and said in the eye, "You want to know a fun game to play here?" I didn't fully respond, but he answered anyway, "Hide and seek." At that point, my friend caught up with us and heard it too. We both were very creeped out, and when we got out of earshot, talked about how something was seriously off with that guy. But we did not want to double back and happened to meet him on our own without weapons and with 3 young boys. So we both picked up some sticks and decided to walk a bit further in the hopes that we would come along another group of people. My heart was racing. There isn't great cell service in all areas of the trail, though it is far from remote. When we happened along more people, we turned around and headed back with them. About a half-mile up, we saw the same guy walking back the other way. We hauled out of there, staying with as many people as possible at one time. There was a man on the cell phone talking about something on the trail. My assumption was he was reporting to this man, but then I was already creeped out and was not checking to ask. Ever since this, I googled for unsolved murders in the area. I couldn't help it. We both just had that feeling. After he spoke, I wasn't sure if he wanted to hurt us or something like that. Maybe I'm paranoid, but I believe in following the spidey senses. Back in October of 1989, my mother and I went up to the western part of North Carolina for a week to see the leaves change color. We rented a cabin which was owned by the cousin of my brother's former high school band teacher who had retired several years earlier. The band director was more or less keeping watch over the place. He lived down the street, but it wasn't until Friday afternoon that we saw him. The cabin was somewhat in the wilderness, but it was near a main road. The band director had to go away for the weekend and was letting us know. We had the number of his cousin in case we needed any help. This was on Friday afternoon. Up until that time, the trip had been uneventful. Friday evening we went to a church dinner which was down the road. When we came back home it was already dark, and my mum started thinking about that we were the only ones on this road and we didn't know the nearest neighbour, which was a little unsettling. The moon wasn't full, but there was a light to it. We had separate rooms in the cabin. The power went out in the cabin shortly after we came home from the church dinner. Then my mother heard what sounded like footsteps, and she saw what appeared to be the outline of a hat. There was a man walking around near the cabin. Then we saw this hat disappear by the woods. By this time both of us are terrified that the man is going to come into the cabin and harm us. Both of us wondered if he had cut the power source, and I decided to sleep in the bed which was under my mother's room. We tried to sleep, and then were awoken by an owl howling. My mother could see the owl's eyes which were looking into the window. The drape couldn't be closed the entire way, and the owl didn't take its eyes off my mum the entire night. The owl also hooted all night. My mother tried to ignore the owl, but its presence really unnerved her. The eyes really unnerved me. Neither of us could sleep, as every noise jarred us. It would be like, "What's that? What noise is that?" Every once in a while we would see the outline of the hat walking around the general area. Then it would go off into the woods. Both of us were freaked out at this point, but we weren't able to leave in the middle of the night. There were no phones in the cabin, and this was long before cell phones were in common usage. The power finally did come back on several hours later, or so it seemed. We were in the wee hours of the morning. Originally we were going to leave on Sunday, but left as soon as the sun came up on Saturday. A few days later, my mother got a call from the band director. Apparently the man we saw was a mountain man, who was a handyman and had been trying to get the power back on for us. He was harmless, but neither the band director or his cousin had told us that he lived out in the woods. We hadn't seen this guy until Friday night when the power went out. Had we learned that, we wouldn't have left on Saturday. He had told the band director that we left a day early. We could laugh about being scared. It was a memorable night after all. So I live in a somewhat medium-sized town, with a mix of cities and backwoods areas. A bus stop I usually use is a good mix. It has buildings close by while also having entryways into the nearby surrounding woods. One morning I was waiting for the bus when I realized it was late that morning. I got annoyed and decided since I was bored, I would go into this little walkway/trail that was nearby. Not all the way, just enough to where I could be secluded by the trees. After a while of checking my phone, I heard the bus stop at the stop a little way down from mine. I headed back to the stop, so I got there and got a fight or flight response that was very intense, almost as if a firearm had been shot off. I turn around to see this crouching creature coming out of the secluded area I was just in. It's pitch dark. Its arms were about the size of half its body. Its head looked like an unused eraser, and the most terrifying part of it was its size. It was easily the size of a telephone or lamp pole. It towered over me and everything around it. Its hands were large and its fingers were thick, and were about the size of half my arm. I didn't know if I should run because I knew this thing could catch me in a few strides. Some time passed while it climbed out the walkway and stood looking at me. Then the bus pulled up and opened its doors. I looked at the bus and back at the creature, but it was gone. Vanished. I looked at the bus driver and his face was normal. I assumed he hadn't actually seen anything. I got on the bus and silently cried for a few minutes. I don't know if this is correlated or not, or if it's just my brain, but that night I had a dream where the exact same thing happened except the bus didn't show up, and that thing tore me to pieces. My friend called it the Line Man, but I don't care about naming it. I went back to the bus stop over the course of the next few weeks, and every time I do, I always check to see if it's there. And it happened again. Once while walking back from church, in a side facing the mountain, I got the same fight or flight response and I stood still. And then I looked to my left, where the thing's giant hand was sitting. It noticed me, so it moved out of the brush towards me, but I ran, and I saw it stand, and it was easily as tall as the church. I ran around, got my car and drove off. I then contemplated what would have happened to me had I not run. The other story is from last night. I was trying to sleep, but I kept on waking up because my heart would beat intensely, giving me an adrenaline rush. Not only that, but I heard banging vibrations and twigs snapping from the back of my property. I got up and looked out my window when I saw something that kept me up for the rest of the night. On my roommate's car was a muddy/rainy handprint bigger than my torso. That morning I got up and went to the bus stop and saw two more things that have stuck with me since. I saw a giant footprint easily about the size of half my body. I also saw my neighbor wailing over the fact that the apparent storm had ripped one of her trees out the ground. But I don't think this was the storm. This isn't fiction, and I actually don't know what to do. This happened to me while I was still in high school. and would have been somewhere between 2005 to 2006. To this day, the experience gives me chills, and I cannot explain it. I am interested to see if someone here has experienced something like it, or heard of it before. After church one Sunday night, my friend and I were taking my cousin back to his house before heading to a restaurant to meet some friends. My cousin at the time lived way back in the woods, some 6 to 8 miles down a very secluded gravel road in the Ozarks of Missouri. It was in the fall, so all the trees were bare. It was a new moon and very dark. Anyway, my friend and I dropped my cousin off without a hitch and began making our way back out of the woods, back to the main country road that would take us back to town. About halfway down the gravel road, back to the country road, we came around a curve and started heading up a small hill that crested about 60 yards ahead of us. When we saw this hill, there looked to be a single deer standing on the crest in the middle of the road. Being that this is the middle of the country, this is not too uncommon obviously, but I thought nothing of it and figured it would run off as we got closer. I remember very vividly that as we were about halfway of the distance between us and it, what I thought was a deer suddenly became very apparent that it was not a deer. Instead, it was a very solid but translucent ball of dense fog or mist, about the size of a deer. It was not standing on the road, but hovered about a meter above it, and was not moving. At the time I thought I might be seeing a smudge on my windscreen, so I reached to wipe the window, but it was nothing, and remained on the road. When we got close enough that my headlights illuminated this thing in full, it slowly rose up into the air, until it was about 20 feet off the ground, paused for a second, and then shot very fast into the woods to the right. I stopped the car and both my friend and I sat there in silence for a few minutes, and then we continued back down the country road, where my friend, who has never swore, finally broke the silence. What the F was that? Where my friend, who never swears, finally broke the silence. What the flip was that? We still talk about this until this day. This experience was quite jarring, and I will not drive between that road again at night. Has anyone ever heard of anything akin to this? I'd love to know what it could have possibly been. I was 22 when this happened, 2 years ago. My name's Grisha. And for the past 5 or 6 years, I've only had 2 friends who have stuck around with me through thick and thin. We live within 5 minutes of each other, in a rural area in southwest Ohio, specifically in the hills of the Ohio River Valley. My friends are called Garrett and Oscar, and my brother, who is part of our friend group, is called Chris. Garrett and Oscar are actually next door neighbors. They both live on decently sized plots of land that they don't actually own. There's lots of farmland and thick forest, and behind Garrett's house are a few small ponds that we used to fish in. His house was pretty small and not in the best condition, and Oscar lived in a medium-sized brick house. We would usually go to Oscar's place to hang out during summer, since his parents were always at camp, and Garrett's house or my house during the other seasons. This is somewhat relevant, but mostly for setup. Like I said, this happened about 2 years ago. Now, one thing you need to know about us is that we are firearm enthusiasts. So when one of my buddies called me and told me he brought a new rifle, I knew we were gonna go shooting before the day was over. I grabbed my own firearms, as did Chris. We jumped in the Jeep and drove over to Oscar's house. It was still early, about 3 in the afternoon, and less than 5 minutes after we'd pulled in, a black Chevy Impala pulled into the driveway, heralding Garrett's arrival. He bought his rifle and pistol as well. We shot for a few hours, taking pot shots at wooden targets Oscar had built in his backyard, and we'd burnt through a pretty large chunk of ammo. I decided I wanted to get something to drink, so I jumped in the Jeep and drove for about 10 minutes to the closest gas station. After getting to the gas station and Grabbing a few cans of the Nectar of the Gods, by which of course I mean Monster, I headed back to my friend's house. When I came back, I saw all three of them standing by the door at the side of the house. Oscar had a very uneasy look on his face. We jumped out the Jeep and walked over and asked him what was going on. "We heard some weird stuff in the woods a few minutes ago," Garrett told me. I asked him what he was talking about, and what he meant by weird stuff. They began to explain that they heard some sort of loud vocalization that sounded between a coyote's yelping and a howl. None of us had any idea what it could have been, so we opted to forget about it. We went inside and decided to play some games, and after a few hours I became bored and started browsing 4chan on my phone and lost track of time. It was getting late. Garrett had walked outside to smoke a cigarette. Oscar was in the toilet, and Chris's girlfriend came and collected him. Oscar's dog started to bark all of a sudden, and it startled me. I heard Garrett coming back inside the house rather quickly and asked him what was going on and if something was wrong. "Step outside and check for yourself," he told me. I came out, curious about what the dogs were barking at, and the second I opened the door, the smell hit me. It was the worst smell I'd ever smelt in my life. Imagine the smell of a wet dog, the smell of a dead deer rotting in the sun, and the smell of landfill combined. That's the best way I can describe it. Repulsed by the stench, I went back inside and told Garrett I can see why he came in so quickly. The dogs were barking, and they appeared to be getting more aggressive. When Oscar finally came out the bathroom, wondering what the commotion was about, Garrett explained the smell, and Oscar seemed more curious than anything. He was also angry, thinking someone was trespassing. He grabbed his firearms and walked out to look around. He told us to stay inside until he returned. Not thinking much of it, we agreed and I began browsing 4chan. I was startled when I heard the sound of a dog yelp, followed by 5 shots in rapid succession. A few minutes later, Oscar burst through the door, instructed us to grab our own firearms, and that there's some tall dude in a ghillie suit that just ended the life of one of his dogs. We grabbed our firearms and followed him outside, staying close the entire time. Sure enough, in the backyard we found one of his dogs. The throat was ripped. This wasn't a small dog either, it was a large poodle mix of some kind, one of the really big ones. Close by we saw the other dog, cowering in his house. The cows in the pasture on the other side of the road were mooing as if they were both afraid and agitated, and I asked Oscar to explain what was going on, and he told me that on the other side of the barn, where he heard the dog yelp, he rounded the corner and saw a figure that looked like a big guy in a ghillie suit running towards the woods. He shot at him, hoping to hit his leg and incapacitate him, but he knew he didn't. The same smell he described earlier was hanging in the air, but it was faint. Garrett and Oscar had flashlights on their rifles, and I had one on my pistol, so I slung my rifle over my back, drew my pistol, and we fanned out to search the area. I wasn't expecting to find anything. I could see Garrett heading to the other edge of the property, and Oscar was moving towards the cow pasture. I headed back towards the barn, and as I started to step in, I lit a cigarette when I felt raindrops hit me. I stepped into the barn to smoke, stood there for under a minute when I heard another shot coming from the direction Garrett went. I started going that way and saw Oscar heading there too. While we were making our way, Garrett fired 3 more shots. "What are you shooting at?" I asked. "I saw the dude, but..." Oscar's voice was shaky and hushed. "It didn't look like a guy." Garrett took a heavy gulp and continued to explain. "It looked like a big dog, or a wolf. I could clearly see its muzzle and ears, and I saw it standing behind some bushes, but it was on its hind legs." He stopped, pulled out a cigarette, hands quivering, but still managed to light it. "I reckon it must have been about 6 feet tall," he went on to say. "What are you even talking about? You know there aren't any wolves around here and coyotes aren't that big." You think a coyote would have had the guts to come up and rip my dog's throat? We've got to be dealing with some pelt-wearing hermit strung out on meth or something." My friend went on to explain he sized up the height by taking reference to a nearby tree that was about 350-ish feet away. So we all walked over to see what he was talking about, and then the rain started to pick up, and the wind was getting strong as well. The clap of thunder put us all on edge, and sure enough, once we reached the tree, which was a large maple, the branch he used to determine the size was close to 8 feet off the ground by our estimate. We decided to put the other dog in the garage and keep it safe from whoever or whatever was messing with us. The dog was inside a small kennel, but if you live in a rural area, you know that junkies always manage to find their way to break into places they shouldn't be. We all went back to the house, locked the dog in, and stayed there. "Should we just leave? We can just crash at Grish's house until morning," Garrett said. I reminded him that Chris and his girlfriend were there, and his face instantly turned to one of disgust. We all hated Chris's girlfriend because she was really annoying, and none of us wanted to deal with her, so we unanimously decided to hunker down with our weapons and stay awake on shifts. It was past midnight at this point, and I volunteered to take first shift until around 2 a.m, while the other 2 lads passed out. I sat there watching the window and became bored after the adrenaline wore off. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a finely crafted Gurkha cigar and stepped out on the back porch, lit it, and began to unwind. I stood there for about 10 minutes when I heard the cows begin to make more noise, and I could hear the other dog barking aggressively inside the garage. I became on edge again and sat my cigar in the ashtray and unslung my rifle and held it on with the safety off. I made sure not to stray too far from the porch light, but I got far enough into the field to see movement in the tree line. I couldn't see what it was, but in a gap in the trees and undergrowth I saw quick flashes of a grey figure. I began feeling uneasy, so I started backing to the house. I could hear rustling over the breeze. It sounded like it was moving towards me, and I pointed my rifle in that direction. I had 10 shots to defend myself before I would reach for my pistol if something were happening. The rustling stopped. I still couldn't see anything. I was around halfway between the porch and the tree line, and time just felt like it stopped. I felt like I was standing there for hours. I turned and ran, hearing something burst out of the undergrowth behind me. I reached the back door, threw it open, struggling to catch my breath due to years of smoking. Garrett and Oscar had woken up. Garrett's shift started soon, and I told them about what happened, and they told me to go lie down for a bit. When I woke up, we would all sit up until sunrise. I lay down on the couch and managed to somehow doze off, and was awoken not long after by Garrett shaking me. "We've got to go now," he said in a panicked tone. "Oscar went outside half hour ago and he still isn't back yet." I was still half asleep, so it took a moment to sink in. "Oscar's gone?" I asked, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I sat up and asked him to explain. We heard the cows outside acting annoyed, but then they started to sound like they were scared, and some of them managed to trample through the fence. Oscar went to see what scared them and told me that if he wasn't back in 10 to call the cops. By now I was lacing my boots up. "Forget that," I said. "Oscar's a brother. We can't just leave him out there. We're going to go find him." I agreed without hesitation. We grabbed all our arsenal and headed out, locked the door behind us, and I could see the spot in the fence where the cows had broken through. We crossed the road and walked into the pasture. This pasture's huge. Part of it is just grass, but it also has small ponds, but most of it is a forest. Flat forest. The kind with not much undergrowth, and where the trees are spaced out more. A great place for cattle, and a great place to hunt too. If I had to guess, I would say at least 200 acres. Garrett used to hunt on this farmer's land too. He was leading the way when we heard a long string of rapid fire, followed by a short pause, followed by 9 more shots. It was clearly Oscar, emptying out his arm, grabbing his pistol and emptying it out too. We ran in that direction even though it sounded far away. and we reached the wooded part of the property and called Oscar's name. We kept making our way to the direction we heard the shots, and panic began to set in with each passing moment. Garrett was losing his cool, and I wasn't far behind. He suddenly fired off a shot and began sprinting. "There he is, that's gotta be him," he was yelling. I gave chase, but was having trouble keeping up. "Slow down," I yelled, trying to get him to listen. "We need to stick together." But he didn't listen. His light was bobbing back and forth as he ran, and I continued to follow. I slipped in a pile of mud and got it all in my mouth. I looked up, just as I was regaining my bearings. When I looked up, I saw a silhouette standing 50 feet away. It looked like a large German shepherd on its back legs. Its ears were pointing up, and its muzzle, it looked like it was pointing in a different direction. I looked down and saw it didn't have front legs, but what looked like arms, with hands and fingers tipped with claws. It seemed to be covered in grey matted fur, but what stood out the most were its piercing yellow eyes. I saw it run off in the direction Garrett was going, so I quickly stood up and gave chase. If Garrett was in danger, I had to do something, and I ran, and I started to hear gunshots, and eventually saw Garrett's light in the distance. He stopped shooting, and I saw the light point at the ground like he was reloading. I caught up and asked him if he saw it. He looked over and noticed Oscar on the ground, his back against a tree, and asked if he was okay. "He's just unconscious," he replied. "We gotta take him home." We both picked him up, slung an arm around our shoulders, and made our way back to the house. We knew, should I say, we were being watched. We could hear movement when we moved, and it stopped when we stopped. I drew my pistol with my free hand and switched on the light attached to it. My eyes stung as sweat made its way inside. Garrett and I were both out of breath, and we still had quite a long way to go. After walking for about 20 minutes, Oscar awoke. We stopped to ask him what happened, and he started to explain things to me, but was cut off by the sound of a branch snapping. Garrett and I both trained our lights in that direction, and saw the now familiar flash of grey just at the edge of the light. I turned in that direction and fired 3 shots. We heard a growl and the sound of something big running away, and we then booked it. If I had kept track of time and the direction as well, we should have broken out of the tree line in 10 minutes, and then see the light from the house. Fortunately, I was right. We ran through the pasture, made it to the fence, crossed the street, and I asked Oscar to unlock the door. He couldn't find the keys, so we tried the window. We went to the back of the house and managed to remove the AC from a window, which Oscar then climbed through. He let us in, and the rest of the night was uneventful. The next day, we talked to the owner of the pasture. He found 3 of his cows dead and partially eaten. He also found a trail of blood into the wooded area that led towards the house, and then the opposite direction to the edge of his property. He also found Oscar's keys on the ground where he'd been knocked out, and where we found him. The farmer explained the blood trail led to the land owned by an old hermit who lives in a trailer in the woods. He apparently never leaves and has relatives bring him food, and is rumoured to have messed with the occult in his younger days. We told the farmer everything, but he didn't believe us, thinking we saw a pack of rabid coyotes or feral dogs. So, what could it have been? Was it a wolf-like cryptid? A werewolf? A dogman? My friend still lives in the same house, and he hasn't seen or heard anything since. My parents own a small cabin in the middle of the woods, on about 60 acres of land in upstate New York, rural Sullivan County to be a bit more precise. We call it, rather appropriately, the camp. The small cabin at the camp is nicely nestled in the middle of the woods. There's a mile-long dirt road surrounded by woods that leads to a small dirt lot and a small yard in front of the building. We use this road to get to and from the camp. Behind the cabin is a clearing that is about 350 yards long and 60 yards wide. The clearing consists of the backyard, the garden, and the end of the yard, and a small field directly behind it. Other than that, the rest of the property is all woods. Woods that we have explored thoroughly, but a vast amount of woods nonetheless. The cabin is made up of only 2 rooms, with one room used as the bedroom and the other used as the living area. There is only one inside wall within the cabin, and its simple purpose is to divide the 2 rooms. Other than that, the 2 rooms are completely open. The cabin had simple furnishings. In the bedroom there was a bunk bed, a sofa couch, and in the living area there was a love seat, a sofa couch, a wooden stove, 2 dressers, a coffee table, a rocking chair, and a small TV. That's it. No kitchen, no bathroom. We used a gas-powered generator to run the few lights and outlets within the cabin, as well as the TV. We had a VCR hooked up to the TV and would occasionally watch movies on VHS or DVD. For those concerned about the bathroom situation, there was an outhouse about 30 yards from the cabin. To cook, we either used the wood stove inside the cabin or the propane grill on the small porch overlooking the backyard. The cabin has multiple windows. There is a fair-sized window that allows us to view the front yard, another fair-sized window on the side of the building that gives us a view of the woods, and a large picture window at the rear end of the cabin that gives us a view of the backyard, garden, and field. These windows are all in the living area. There are 2 small windows in the other room of the cabin, but they are not relevant. Myself, my younger brother by about 3 years, and my mother and father spent just about every weekend at the camp when we were younger. Simply put, we grew up in the woods and were certainly no strangers to the outdoors. With that being said, I've had my fair share of experiences, most of which had logical explanations. However, the event you're about to hear stands out, because to this day, not one of us can explain it. This took place in summer of 2008. I was 9 years old at the time. It was a perfectly normal Saturday in June. My brother and I carried out a normal routine of riding 4-wheelers, playing outside, catching frogs and salamanders. Nothing out of the ordinary throughout the day, as you would expect. Towards the evening, it started getting a bit chilly. So my brother and I decided to call it a day and head inside the cabin for the night. I gassed up and started the generator, and we went inside for the evening. Once inside, I filled up the wooden stove and started the fire to get some heat going, as it was going to be a rather chilly night. My dad had just finished grilling the usual chicken, potatoes and burgers as he brought the food inside at around 7 p.m. We all ate and relaxed for a little while to let our food settle. The sun had just started to set. Fast forward about half hour and I started to get bored. My mother then reminds me that she had brought my plug-and-play Wheel of Fortune game with us to play. I excitedly went and plugged the RCA cables into the TV and set up the game. The TV was situated just to the left of the big picture window at the rear end of the building. It was dusk at this point. By dusk I mean it was getting darker, but there was still plenty of light to see outside. It was about 8:30 p.m. at this point, in upstate New York. It isn't pitch black outside until around 9:30 in the middle of summer, so there was still plenty of light out. We'd been playing Wheel of Fortune for a few minutes at this point. I was sat just a few feet away from the TV in a rocking chair. My mother handed me the game back for my turn when it happened. Just as I spun the wheel of the game, this extremely bright purple flash of light emitted from just behind me, at the front of the building. I turned my whole body around to see what it was and noticed that my parents and brother had done the same. I immediately noticed that the front yard was engulfed in this extremely bright purple light, We all watched as this purple light moved through the front window of the cabin. Once inside, it completely lit up the interior of the building. We all sat motionless, moving, nothing but our heads as this mysterious, bright purple light passed by us, then proceeded out the back picture window and into the backyard, lighting up everything in its path. The light then sped off through the yard towards the garden. We watched it pass through the garden, then through the field, and just like that, it disappeared into the woods. This all transpired within a few seconds. I dropped the game as I was in shock, and I turned around towards my parents, and already knowing their answer, nervously asked, "Did you see that?" They nodded, yes, in unison. My little brother ran over to the sofa my parents were on, and sat between them. I quickly followed his lead. In the hours that followed, nothing else happened. That was out the ordinary. I asked my dad what he thought the purple light was, and he told me he didn't know. My mother suggested it may have been lightning, which we all, including her, shut down as soon as the suggestion left her tongue. There was no way that the light was lightning. I have experienced many thunderstorms in my life, even at 9 years old, and no bolt of lightning has ever come close to replicating the appearance of the bright purple light. We all slept in the living area that night, my mother and myself on the sofa, and my little brother and father on the love seat. We openly talk about that strange purple light to this day, and still not one of us has any idea what we experienced or has experienced anything like it again. We still spend a lot of our free time at the camp, as I mentioned. I have experienced many other things over the years, but never anything like the light. I have researched logical explanations such as ball lightning, and I've even researched paranormal phenomena such as orbs, but nothing has ever come close to match the appearance of that bright purple light that seemed to form from nothing. I've spent quite a lot of time outdoors in the last 2 years. In 2016, I thru-hiked the AT in 205 days, 2,189 miles up in the East Coast. This year, I rode my bike up the 800-mile Arizona Trail, then rode Santa Barbara to Vancouver, British Columbia, along the Pacific Ocean. Now I'm 1,100 miles into a southbound Continental Divide trail hike that went through Montana and Wyoming, and will enter Colorado soon. I've always been fascinated with the paranormal, and started listening to Coast to Coast AM at 17 or 18. No story on there has hooked me more than the likes of George Knapp's interview with David Paulides. The phenomenon is still so bizarre and intriguing. So I'll just tell the stories that come to mind in no particular order. I'm just gonna say it, but places totally have vibes to them. Some places that we walk through are straight up hair-raising, and I can never figure out why. Yet I've confirmed it with other hikers. I'll usually ask, "Hey, did you feel weird back there?" And they'll always go, "Yeah, I did. Just didn't feel right." One place in Utah comes to mind. It was a short day hike I did with my girlfriend in Canyonlands. Forget the name, but look up the trail on the side of an old crater. I think they theorize it was a meteor strike ages ago, but I don't really know. Anyway, we got to a spot, sat down, and were suddenly overcome with an incredible sense of lethargy, to the point where we both wanted to fall asleep on that rock. I'm a pretty disciplined hiker, so I stood up and said that we couldn't dally. Oddly, I also had this gut feeling that we shouldn't fall asleep, and also weirdly my girlfriend said offhandedly in a joking manner that some other day hikers are coming up the trail, and to be careful up there. There's a vortex that will suck you in and put you to sleep. She meant vortex in the hiker context of a town that'll suck you in and keep you doing unplanned zeros. But still, odd choice of language, right? And I'm reminded of cases of UFOs and Fae abductions that start with people inexplicably falling asleep in the woods in the middle of the day. Speaking of weird places, the AT Trail crosses through an area known as the Bennington Triangle. Going south, you cross over Glastonbury Mountain and then enter the town of Bellington. Apparently there were 4 or 5 missing 411-style disappearances there in the 1940s, and the natives avoided the area because they believed devils lived on the mountain. When I walked through the day before, I had written a blog post about how the trail was teaching me to follow my gut, and how following my gut always seemed to save me from storms and other things that just generally turn out good. Well, this day I was planning to go through a small town called Manchester Centre, then climb up onto Glastonbury Mountain, and camp on the mountain. In Manchester Centre, I eat a burrito and have the worst stomach cramps I've ever seen. I tried using the bathroom to wait it out, and nothing, so I booked a room at a motel. Literally the second I paid and get to the room, my stomach pain goes away. This was cramps so bad, I was hunched walking over, and then they just disappeared in a matter of seconds. But I'd already paid, so I stayed. I didn't have the runs or anything like that, and everything was 100% normal after I changed my plans. I climbed the mountain and went to Bellington the next day, only after I realized that I would have been on the mountain in the night of a full moon. Is that relevant? No idea. But it just struck me as very odd, how I wrote about following my gut, and then my gut literally forced me not to climb the mountain. Oh, on the way down is where the long trail at the AT intersect, and that intersection is where a young woman disappeared in the 40s without a trace. Weird. Now that I'm thinking of weird places with bad vibes, it reminds me of the small 5-mile loop I do at home in Missouri. When I walk this, I usually always stopped about 3 miles in and turned around. No real reason, that's just what I always did. I went in there maybe 4 years ago with an ex-girlfriend. We ate about 1.5 grams of shrooms each, and the first hour of the trip were great, hanging out about a mile into the loop. Then we decided to hike more and enter the section that I unintentionally avoided. It was strange. The only way I can describe it is that it felt like evil descended on us. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering, and I felt like this deep pit of despair and depression came from me out of nowhere, and I just knew that year was when I was going to pass. I knew that our relationship was over, and we both got real quiet and didn't talk for about half an hour. Then I came to the ledge and kept getting these horrible images of her running at full speed and charging off this ledge. Then all of a sudden the oppressive energy lifted, and we both burst out at the same time. Did you feel that? So she also felt that incredible negative energy, and felt that we were done. Our reactions were very interesting. We both felt like we should focus more on spirituality and develop a stronger spiritual base. I kept having the thought that the greatest lie is that there is no good or evil in this world. If you believe that, you're truly vulnerable to evil. So after this experience, we got into hypnosis a little. She could fall into trance very easily. One session, I took her back to the day she absolutely freaked, and she said that we were attacked by a demon who attacked those who are undecided. Now, I'm not religious at all, and still am not, and I think this is her Catholic upbringing coloring her experience, but I do think there was something very evil that day in the woods. Even with these experiences and all the content I listen to regarding the paranormal and missing 411, I don't feel at all threatened or in danger in the woods. I'd say 99% of the time out there, I feel as comfortable as if I was sitting on my couch at home. We were built to be in nature, and the woods and the wild, they're really not threatening places. Spend enough time out there and you'll feel right at home. I think this phenomenon, whatever it was, had an element of choice and free will. I've always maintained that I absolutely do not want any truly weird encounters anywhere, and I tend to think that this mindset matters. However, like mediums say, they can repress and shut down their abilities. Which reminds me, I met a hiker in Montana that hiked with us a bit. She said she used to do a lot of spiritual type work, And when she was really sensitive, she could literally sense all sorts of stuff and see entities and spirits in the woods. But it freaked her out, so she had to shut that down. Not sure what to think about that, but interesting nonetheless. Perhaps this is why children seem to disappear more. It could be much easier to coerce and trick a child than an adult. It seems folklore always talks about permission, like how vampires can't enter your domain without it, how fairies try to trick you into eating and drinking their food, and if you do, you're stuck in their realm, how entities will try and lure you off the path. It seems the common thread in that element of free will on your part, like you have to willingly participate or give to permission to be tricked. That's something that's given me a lot of peace, because I do feel very attuned to my intuition, and the longer I hike, the more intuitive I become. I think this sixth sense really does help keep me safe out there, and perhaps our modern people are at great risk in the wild now because we have let this natural sixth sense deteriorate. I also feel intuitively that much of this weirdness has a spiritual element. How or why I can't articulate well, but from everything I've experienced and all the info I've read, I tend to think that it's not simply a flesh or blood material phenomenon, but more deeply tied into our spirit and the spiritual plane, whatever that may be. I used to live near a really well-known forest. It was claimed to be haunted, known as Black Forest. Now this forest is super creepy, and as you can imagine, dark, hence the name. I had one very scary and startling experience while driving through this forest, which made me never step foot in the area again. On a weekend, I was invited to go hang out with some friends, and I had nothing else to do, so I agreed. It was around 8 or 9, and it was dark out. Now, there are 2 ways I could get to my friend's house. 1, go through Black Forest, or 2, go around the forest and add 20 minutes to my journey. I usually avoid the forest because the roads are somewhat confusing, and I just couldn't see very well, there being no lights and all. However, today, I was impatient, and decided to go through the forest. The ride to my friend's house was very uneventful, but the darkness of it all was very unpleasant to say the least. I stayed at my friend's house and started to head back around midnight, or near enough 1 a.m. Now, this is when I had my experience. While I was driving, I looked at my GPS a lot, because of the roads, and I always wanted to check where I was going because some of these roads look like an actual road, but are merely driveways for a lot of these houses. I didn't want to trap myself in someone's driveway, so I checked my GPS a lot. So I was driving and came to a stop in front of a red light, right under a very dim street light. It was still pitch black, and I was the only one on the road. As I was getting there, I got a very weird feeling as if someone was watching me. I then looked to my passenger side door, only to see this glowing, zombie-looking like man, wearing what I could only describe as rags. He didn't look alive. His skin looked like it was falling off. He was very grey in colour, and was just staring at me. I really thought my heart was going to explode because I was so scared. Even though the light was red, I floored it. But I wanted to see if the thing staring into my car was actually real. And right as I crossed through the median, I looked back. Nothing was there, and there was nowhere he could have gone that fast. I was spooked and drove all the way home, trying not to hit any red lights. This was right before a huge forest fire.